Hello and welcome to Fats on Film. I am your host, Hannah Ogilvie, and this is the podcast where we discuss all things fat representation in film, TV, and wider media. And this week, I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Vincent M Gaine. Hello, Vincent.
Don't ask me to weep for these podcast listeners. I won't weep for them any more than I would those who died at Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, you are the first guest to come in with a deep pool from the film, really setting the tone.
Well, I do my best. Hello,
Yes.
Hannah. Hello,
Hello.
listeners of Fats on Film. Very happy to be here. I have become in fairly short time a very big fan of this podcast, and I am
Oh.
honoured to be contributing.
Oh, thank you so much, Vincent. That means the world to me. Like, I'm sure as someone who's just in this community can appreciate when you put something out there and it is received greatly. It really is a very joyous and humbling experience, because for so long I've had these thoughts in my head going, does anyone else agree with me or hear me or care? And luckily, like listeners like yourself, listeners who are listening right now, have been so gracious in allowing me to take time out of their week to explain fat representation in our media. So thank you so much. That's so lovely. We are here today because we're talking about a thriller, crime thriller, as Wikipedia describes it. Se7en, 1995 Se7en. So it's an interesting one, because I think when we were first speaking about you coming on the podcast, Vincent, we said, you asked, oh, how would we talk about that? Because the fatness or the fat phobia in the film isn't a central theme. So how much of this podcast can we talk about? But you were still quite strong on talking about it still. So are those feelings after you've watched it again this week? Or do you still feel this is going to be a good topic to get into?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Firstly, in terms of the Se7en's representation of fatness, I think
Mm-hmm.
it is very illustrative of a great many social and political ideas that we can get into. And
Yeah.
more broadly, it's a very rich film that we can have a really in-depth discussion on as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting film. This is, highly considered one of the best films ever made. So we're going in big. We're tackling one of the big ones. It was released in 1995, crime thriller directed by David Fincher, of Fight Club, Gone Girl more recently, and a film that fucked me up, Panic Room. That film made me so terrified of being burgled. I had to check multiple times that the door was locked before I went to bed. Really, really messed me up. Love that film so much. I think that's one of his underrated ones, personally. Written by Andrew Kevin Walker, who hasn't actually done too much, but did do Sleepy Hollow in '99 and the screenplay for 2010's The Wolfman remake. And then cinematography by Darius Konji, I think is how you say his name, sorry. And he also did Delicatessen, which is, for me, like, I totally saw those parallels. Have you seen Delicatessen?
Not all of it. I've seen clips, and
Yeah.
even from those clips, I know what you mean.
Yes, like a real griminess to how it's been filmed. As soon as I read that, I was like, oh well, of course. So the cast includes Morgan Freeman, Brad Pitt, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Kevin Spacey. I'm going to say at the very top, listeners, I know these people are not the best people that we have. So we're not going to talk about their individual personal drama. I do not mean to undermine anything that that they've done to other people, but just for the sake of this podcast, we're going to talk about them as actors and characters in this film. And it had a budget of $34 million, which is not a lot. And that probably stems from David Fincher's previous attempts at filmmaking, which we can get into. But it did make $327.3 million in 1995. And they really didn't think it was going to make that much money. It was middling test audiences. The studio was really not keen on the bleak ending again, which we'll get into. But it became the highest grossing film of 1995. So massive, massive success. It received one Oscar nomination for Best Editing and was nominated at the BAFTAs for Best Screenplay, original screenplay, I should say. But At the MTV Movie Awards, it got 3 nominations. One for Best Movie, one for Most Desirable Male in Brad Pitt, which I just don't understand that at all. In this film, like, I don't get it. And then Best Villain for Kevin Spacey's John Doe. And then, because they were so keen to get some Oscar buzz for this, they re-released it in December following the original September release. But it obviously no nominations came for Fincher or Morgan Freeman or Brad Pitt. And it currently sits at number 19 in IMDb's top 250 films of all time. So, like I say, it's one of the big ones. So, Vincent, can I pass to you now and let me and the audience know what is Seven all about?
Seven is about so many things, many of them beginning with S. But let us, if you want to talk about it thematically, it is a film about sin. It is about wanton violence. It is about the breakdown of morality in America.
Mm-hmm.
It is about deep systemic soul corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Narratively, it concerns two police detectives, the aging and soon-to-be retired William Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman, and the recent young detective, just transferred into the department, David Mills, played by Brad Pitt. These two detectives investigate a series of very grisly and very strange murders, and rapidly realize that the murders are based upon the 7 deadly sins. The film takes place over the course of a week, Monday to Sunday. So we have 7 days, we have 7 victims, we have 7 sins. It is in that respect, a very tightly constructed film, although not always as tightly as you might imagine. Is it 1 victim per day? Well, not exactly, no. And along the way, our detectives find themselves confronting many of their most deeply held beliefs and come to look at the world maybe a little differently, and certainly have experiences that they will never forget. I mean, we do full spoilers here, don't we?
Oh, 100%. Full spoilers, they're swearing. I mean, yeah, we have to. We have to with this film.
Yes. Well, in which case, shortly on the 7th day, the killer gives himself up and embroils the 2 detectives. He turns out to be a fairly literally anonymous man called John Doe, and he embroils them in the final schemes, and it doesn't end well for anybody.
Yes, I mean, the ending of Seven is always quoted as one of the best twists or best finales ever committed to film. And rewatching it just this afternoon with this lens on, with this analytical lens on, I was really struck by how poignant the ending really is. I actually would, if I'd had the time and or if I had the foresight, I'd have loved to have gone back to read what reviewers thought of it when it first came out, because in hindsight, it's almost 30 years old. Oh my god, it's almost 30 years old.
Yep.
Just hello. Yeah, like I'd love to know, like, obviously we look on it so kindly now, but I wonder if at the time, like, I did briefly look at how it has a 65 Metascore, which just feels so low for a film of such cinematic magnitude, right?
Well, then again, it's got 82% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Well,
based
there
on
you go.
85 reviews, which indicates Rotten Tomatoes is a very problematic meter, but metric. But it does indicate that there is a majority of positive reviews.
Yeah, totally.
I remember when the film came out, although it's officially a 95 release, it came out in the first week of 1996 in the UK. And I remember it being very well received. At that time, the top level film critic in the UK was Barry Norman, and he rated Seven one of his top films of the year.
Wow.
So yeah, I think it's generally quite critically well received, and it's easy to see why.
Yeah.
It is a film that is extremely well constructed. It has a very, it's in some ways, despite being a serial killer thriller, it is in some ways visually stylized like an art film. You mentioned the cinematography by Darius Khondji. There are so there were some particular techniques used in the cinematography that were unusual and distinctive. It's almost surprising it was nominated for editing, but not for cinematography. But there you go.
Yes.
So it is, I think, critically quite well held up. And when one comes across like best, lists of best films of the 90s, particularly best thrillers, then Seven is generally in there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So what's your history with this film? What's your relationship with Seven?
My relationship with Seven is quite an interesting one because, as I said, this came out in January of 1996 in Britain. One of the things that I've discovered taking part in podcasts is that I seem to be a bit older than most people doing these. Seven was the first 18 certificate film that I saw in the cinema.
Oh,
but at the time I was only 16.
oh,
Naughty.
Alert the authorities.
Yes. Alert the authorities to prosecute the staff of a cinema that's now closed.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it was a long time ago. I saw it when I was 16. I saw it with my parents, both of whom hated it.
I was going to ask.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure neither of them ever watched it again.
Oh.
And not because they found it boring or silly, but they found it was just too nasty, too horrible. Anytime it would come up in conversation, my dad's word would be, "Oh, it's horrible, so horrible." To which I thought, well, fair enough if that's your take on it, but thesaurus maybe. Now, that first viewing for me, I remember it left me somewhat in shock. I distinctly remember leaning forwards and resting on the very end of the film on the seat in front of me and just going. I was not sure what I had seen, but I knew it was powerful.
Yes.
And the fact that it was powerful, I liked that, and Seven ended up being one of my films of the year. I didn't watch it again for quite a while until 2002, and I remember watching it with my then girlfriend, and she found it seriously troubling. However, during that space in 2002, I actually watched it quite a lot because I did my master's dissertation on the work of David Fincher.
Oh, perfect.
I did an in-depth discussion. At the time, Fincher had only made 4 films: Alien 3, Seven, Fight Club, and Panic Room. And I did a reading of those 4 films anyway, that they were all, I did a very religious reading of them, that they were all to do with the fall, as in, the fall from innocence, the end of the world, and then a form of redemption, that they were all about the fall from innocence or from virtue, and then a form of redemption. On reflection, it was a bit of a forced argument in some respects, and I wouldn't try doing it again because I don't think there's any redemption in The Social Network. And I wouldn't say there's really much of a fall in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button.
Sure. Yeah.
So, but at the time, it felt like an interesting reading.
Yeah.
And David Fincher I would consider him one of my favorite directors. He's one whose work I can always go back to and find a lot that's really interesting. I think he is a fantastic visual stylist.
Yeah.
He's fascinating in terms of the way he has sort of he's one of those filmmakers who's very much embraced the movement to digital filmmaking.
Yes, definitely.
I would say that Seven is, and I've gone back to it repeatedly, most recently for this podcast, and it always impresses me. It always disturbs me, and even when I know what's coming, I'm still like, oh God, no. So I would say I do admire it and even enjoy it as a very finely assembled piece of cinema.
Yeah.
How about you? What's your history with it?
Yeah, my history. So when this film came out, if we take the UK release of 1996, I would have been, well, to be turning 4 that February. So I didn't see it as a 4-year-old.
However, you kids.
I know. Little scamps. But what I did see when it came out was Saw. And oh my God, that just went into my brain. I was like, I want to see more like this. And I remember the days of the IMDb message boards, and you'd go down and someone had written, what are films similar to Saw? And someone had said it's heavily influenced by Seven. And I was
yes.
who
Clearly.
and what is this? And I remember that's when I first sought out Seven. And like again, watching this film now, a bit older, a bit wiser, more analytical. I mean, it's so clear the links, even to the point of like the photography is even like referenced within Seven, is referenced in Saw. And I just, yeah, very much a very clear line between the two there. And I remember thinking, again, like going back to how I feel about the ending shook me, especially just, I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow being the, I don't know, a darling of Hollywood, and to be dispatched so brutally
What's
felt.
in the
What's in
box?
the box? Oh my god! I mean, even that, like Brad Pitt, like whole crying, the ensemble just works so perfectly. But this idea that David Fincher was brave enough or brazen enough to butcher this darling in such a horrible way. I know we don't see it, but I mean, you know, your imagination is doing all the work there. I think is really awesome. I think it's, and I appreciate that's like the nastiest. Again, another scene which we'll get into like properly is the lust victim. It is like, even watching it back today, it really does send chills up my spine. And I want to point out, and I'm sure you probably have as well, Vincent, I've watched meaner, darker, grosser stuff than this now, because we have become desensitized as an audience. We need to be a bit more shook. And as much as there is some grim stuff happening in Seven, you don't see a lot. You see the aftermath. And yet there's something so visceral about, again, the world that's been built, the apathy which is dripping off the page. Like, some of the way the cops speak to each other is so just sad. They just don't care, and no one seems to care apart from our central two, and they care in very different ways. Something about it just makes it so sad, and just like, what was it all for? And I think that's where I come to with this. Like, if I compare that to Saw, you know, Jigsaw's whole MO is like, you know, he wants you to appreciate the life that you have. And if you do the horrible thing, you get to live your life. If you don't, then you'll die. Whereas with this, it is the same kind of morality tale. Like, you should atone for your sins, but there's also no getting out of it either. It is hopeless until it's not, because then Somerset's like, I'll be around at the end, and that's the end of the film. I love it that the 90s were so good at ending a film, just ending it. There's no like, you know, 10-minute ending where everyone wraps up and like has a dinner. It's like, no, we're done, move on. Let's go through the plot, and then we'll like start hitting things that we need to talk about. So the film opens with just sirens blaring.
That's right.
And we've got Somerset, Detective William Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman. He's getting ready for his day at work, and he's been called to a new crime scene. And you hear like the kind of cop say, "Oh, it's a crime of passion." And Somerset
Look at all the
said,
passion on
"Look,
that wall.
look at all the passion on that wall." And
In reference to a guy who's had his head blown off.
yes, exactly that. So it's this idea of like crime of passion, and again, that's a really interesting term or phrase, isn't it? Because passion is meant to be seen as this lovely thing that should be protected. We should all want like passion. You know, if someone felt passionately about you, that sounds very, very nice and something we should be aspiring to. But crime of passion means usually that there's been a domestic violence incident and one partner has killed the other. Somerset asks, did the kids see it?
And the other cop responds, who cares?
Who cares? And
Yeah.
that, Vincent, like really got to me, because I was like, oh my God, there's just no hope. And you know, he says something like, oh, we can't wait for you to retire. Like something so nasty. And you again, within two lines of dialogue, we know who this person. He's such an outsider in the police force, in the city which they call Metro. He's an outcast. He's seen as someone who gets too involved. He looks too deeply, where all the other cops clearly just see it as a day job. You know, go to the scene, pick up your evidence, clean it up, and move on to the next one, because there will be a next one. And in that moment, we see that Somerset has empathy. It's interesting because I spoke earlier about apathy, and empathy is a real big thing in this film.
Absolutely.
And when I was reading up on this in research, a lot of people were saying that like Somerset is apathetic to where he is, and they have that conversation in the bar later on about, you know, I can't exactly remember what it is. I know you'll remember, but they talk about you want me to. Yeah, go on.
Somerset says, I don't feel I can continue to live in a place that worships apathy as if it was some kind of virtue.
Exactly that. Yes. And Mills says, I'm not going to agree with you.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, Mills is adamant about that. He's like,
Mm-hmm.
you want me to agree with you? You want me to say it's all fucked up? We should all go
Yeah.
live in a log cabin, but I don't. I
Mm-hmm.
do not agree with you.
Mm-hmm. I do
I
not agree
can't.
with you.
Yeah.
And but relating that scene later on to this scene now, it's interesting that I think like Somerset does have empathy, but I wonder whether he has empathy because the victim is a child, and we see child as innocence.
Potentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's notable, I think, if you think about it. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
interesting point. Children are referenced several times in the film. We mentioned this kid at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
Tracy, played by Gwyneth Paltrow,
Yes.
Mills's wife. She gets pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
She is also mentioned that she has been a teacher.
Yes.
She's looking to try and teach again, but the schools in the city are too ghastly. Somerset mentions that he used to have a partner who was pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
and here's an unusual thing for a film from the mid-90s. They may not say abortion,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
but he makes it clear that he suggested to his partner that an abortion might be the best thing, and she agreed.
Mm-hmm.
So although children, and of course, Tracy gets pregnant and then dies horribly
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when Mills didn't even know about it. So it's notable, although they are mentioned, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we ever see a single child in the film. Or if we do, it's very
we
brief.
It is very brief. We hear them because I had the
Okay.
subtitles on because I just want to make sure I got things down verbatim. And subtitles show a lot of children screaming in the background, especially when they first investigate John Doe's residence. There's children in the background, like neighbors,
That's
and
true.
and then the chase through where Mills is pursuing John Doe, he runs through like several flats, and there's some kids on a bed watching cartoons,
You're
and they
absolutely right.
point, and that's it. That is
Yeah.
it. And again, that's really interesting. I really want to get into that when we like run through, but I find their reaction very odd. And because I don't know, like someone just ran into my house, I wouldn't just be like, oh, they went that way. I'd be like freaking out, you know?
Well,
Um,
that's the interesting thing, because on the one hand, they're not freaking out, but at the
mhm.
same time, they almost look kind of numbed. It's
Yes. Yes.
Mills bursts in with his gun,
Hmm.
and Doe has already run through with
Yeah.
his gun,
With
and
his
the kids
gun.
are like,
Yeah.
almost
That
this
way.
blank stare,
Yeah. Yeah.
which I
Absolutely.
suppose is again the apathy. Everyone in this city
In this
is
city. Hmm.
completely they're not necessarily
Hmm.
stoned, but
Hmm.
they are kind of
Mm.
zoned out. Quick point on something you mentioned. You
Hmm.
said the city is metro.
Yeah.
I've always imagined I've always noticed the city as being nameless. It's not identified. Where is it
Yes.
referred to as metro?
So when Arlie Emery's captain,
Yeah.
when Somerset says, I want you to be reassigned, he goes, "We can't, that doesn't happen in Metro." And I always thought, oh,
Oh,
that's just a name. But then when John Doe gets out of the taxi at the end at the precinct, it says on the taxi Metro City.
okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So
well
I put
done.
those two together and I was like, oh, it must be called Metro.
Huh.
Or that's just like the nickname, like the Big Apple.
Or it's a reference to, here in the metropolitan area or
Yeah,
metropolitan city
exactly.
taxis. I doubt
Yeah,
it's Metropolis somehow.
I know. I know. Well, there's that theory that this is actually Gotham. And again,
Okay.
if it is, then that would be a DC reference, and there's some kind of connection there.
Hmm.
I'm not the biggest
Tenuous.
DC nerd. I know, but I'll throw it out there. It's my podcast.
Fair, fair.
So if I've wrote this down correctly, so we have this scene and we go into Monday. Do we get our opening credits before we go into Monday?
Yes, the way it works is that first the pre credit sequence is
Mm-hmm.
that it's the introduction of Somerset. It's also the introduction of Mills, because Mills comes to that crime
He
scene as
meets us at the
well.
crime scene. Yes, he does.
And it becomes clear there's certain tension between them.
Mm.
I mean, in some respects, actually, the film is also kind of a buddy film.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
In the tradition of something like Lethal Weapon or 48
Mm.
Hours.
Mm-hmm.
With the fairly cliched version of it's the wise older black cop and the younger loose cannon
Yes.
white cop, and yet although the film works within that genre cliche, it manages to do many interesting things with it.
Yes.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
we establish the tension, and then we go into some very, very weird credit sequences. I remember when I saw the film for the first time, I think myself and each of my parents were like, what was that?
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
get the, I have a DVD 2-disc edition of this, but it's from years ago, so there may be more up-to-date versions now. But one of the extras on there is all about the construction of these of that title sequence, and the different frame rates used and the overexposure used to create it. And of course, the key thing about that opening sequence is it features the title being presented in a way that is weird, because technically the title of the film isn't Seven, it's Se7en.
Yeah.
SE, the number 7, and then EN. So immediately from the get-go, this is telling you that things are off. And so we have this strange montage, the things being cut out and put together, and then the song being played over it is a track by Nine Inch Nails.
Yes.
And you don't hear much of the lyrics, but the very final lyrics at the very end say, "You bring me closer to God." What this is sort of getting at is an idea of through pain, through suffering, is a way of getting closer to God. I mean, you mentioned a link between Seven and Saw. Perhaps another film that'd be interesting to draw a parallel with is Martyrs.
I was going to say Martyrs, yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. And then we get Monday.
On the credits, yeah, I totally agree. I think the first time I saw it, I was like, this is different. And it's very eerie and creepy and gross. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like it really sets the scene of what this film is going to be. And I cannot help now, though, whenever I watch it, go, well, this is what American Horror Story have ripped off for the past, I don't know, X amount of years since. Like, even the music is so similar. And I know Ryan Murphy probably say, oh, it's an homage, but I'm like, there's an homage and then there's a straight rip.
I don't know. I feel it's a fine line between the
Do
two.
you?
One person's homage is another person's ripoff.
That's fair. And I am also like so biased towards skewing against Ryan Murphy. So maybe that's where I'm sitting. So we go into Monday. It's raining.
As it does for most of the movie.
For most of the movie, until it doesn't, which is very important.
Indeed.
Yes. So the rain, it is dark, and then we see that we see kind of Mills kind of like getting ready, and he's eagerly, putting on his uniform or his suit or his tie, and he's right by the phone waiting for it to ring. So he's super eager to get started. And he obviously gets the assignment like, oh, there's been a crime scene. We need you over here. He gets there. He's got a coffee for Somerset. Somerset's gone, no. And I was like, oh. But again, it's this idea. Somerset's very like, I've got 7 days until I retire. I don't need to be your mate. You don't need to get me coffee. We're here to do a job. Let's get it done. And again, it is that idea of like, Somerset's already halfway out the door. He's checked out. And Mills wants to prove himself. He wants to prove that he's not just this rookie, as everyone keeps referencing to him. And they get into this house, and there's the police, and they're again very just like, we've not touched anything. We haven't moved anything. Like, that's not our job. And Mills says, have you not even checked for life signs, or I can't remember what the right word is there. Vital signs. Thank you. Vital signs. Have you checked for vital signs? And he was like, well, no, once you see him, his head is in a bowl of spaghetti. He's not breathing. And they get in, and it's a very dark room. And I noticed straight away there are 2 TVs. And we pan over and we see that there is actually, Mills says, someone called Guinness, we have a record here. And that's when the camera pans over and you can see through the flashlight that there is a very large man sat there, looks to be over a kitchen table.
Mm-hmm.
Through Mills's reaction, it's obvious it doesn't smell very nice, as I can imagine. A dead body that's been dead for a while doesn't smell very good. There are cans of spaghetti sauce all over, like loads of them, like he's hoarded them.
Like the darkest version of Andy Warhol's soup cans.
Exactly that, exactly that. And Mills asks, who said this was a murder? And Somerset says, no one. And then Mills goes, well, guy's heart's got to be the size of a canned ham. If
Mm-hmm.
this isn't a coronary, I can't say that word, coronary, I don't know. And then Somerset notices that the hands and the feet have been tied with what looks to be barbed wire. There's a bucket of sick under the table. And we realize that this isn't like a case of this large man eating himself to death. He has been forced into this position. I think, as looking at it through the lens of fat representation, I'm instantly so against Mills, because I'm just like, how, again, we come back to this empathy. He is so unempathetic to this victim who he doesn't even believe is murdered to begin with. He just like, oh, well, clearly what happened here was he's ate himself to death. And it isn't until Somerset's very quiet during all this. He's very methodical. He doesn't want to make any judgments. And then actually at one point he tells Mills to be quiet a few times, right? He's like, I don't need you interfering with my process while I deduce this scene. What did you think when you watched this scene again with this fatness lens on there?
Well, I having with my fatness lens now applied, thanks in no small part to listening to earlier episodes of this podcast, I was very much thinking about, my recollection is that the gluttony victim, as it turns out to be, because that's, this is the first of our 7 deadly sins. Here is a man who has been victimized essentially and killed by virtue of gluttony. Virtue gluttony. There's an interesting
yeah, that's a really good oxymoron there. Yeah.
And I knew that he was presented as something grotesque, and all the appearances of the gluttony victim are designed, I think, to make the viewer, get the viewer kind of on somewhat on Mills's, to agree with Mills. That said, Mills is so nasty about it. At one point he says, how that fat fuck even fit out the door? And it's like, dude, seriously, that is not cool.
He's dead on the table. And
yeah.
just like no respect, no grace. Even that's, he says that after he knows something is suspect. He says that to the coroner. And you're just like, why don't you care, man? Like, why are you not curious to know why this person has been murdered in such a vicious way? This isn't, and again, Somerset brings this up, like, if he wanted to kill him, he could have just gone out and got a gun. This is like process. He stopped to get more food at one point to keep feeding this man. And actually, I think it's very important to know at this point, we don't know this victim's name.
Now, I picked up on this actually.
Yeah.
When we were talking about what sort of areas to look at, there are, funnily enough, 7 victims in this movie. You don't say, and only 2 of them are not named. One of them is the gluttony victim.
Yeah.
Oh no, sorry, I lie. The 2 other victims are not named. And do you know which 2 of those are?
Yeah, it's lust and pride.
The women.
I know.
Yep.
And one of them women being a sex worker.
Indeed.
I'm just like, I know it's 95. I know it's 95, but it is very interesting how the film is positioning its empathy. Like, as an audience, it films are showing you a point of view, and we can only take what it gives us. And if the film is, I don't know if it's purposefully or it's just accidental where they withhold these specific people's names, but it does mean we know less about them. We know less about their backstory. And it also means we know less about whether they, quote unquote, deserve their fate. Indeed.
I would say you could argue in that respect, the film kind of presents us with 3 perspectives.
Oh, okay.
We have the perspective of Mills,
Mm-hmm.
who I think is to a large extent kind of representing maybe the perspective of the city more broadly, certainly in terms of the something of a disregard towards some. Then you've also got the perspective of John Doe, the murderer, whose perspective, is very much of judgment. He is there to deliver judgment. At least that's how he sees it, and we might be invited to see him, to see things on his perspective. Although I think most of us might think, yeah, I think you went a bit far there, John.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, I understand where he's coming from, but I'm not agreeing with him in any way.
Yes. And then, of course, we have the perspective of Somerset, who
Yes, yes.
does have empathy, who does have compassion. And I think we are potentially invited to view things his way, while at the same time, but then perhaps there is a broader perspective as well, which is Mills does have some idealism, but his idealism also seems somewhat out of place as much as Somerset's empathy does, because the film as a whole, the world of the film, is one that is so utterly hopeless and nihilistic.
Yes.
It's notable, I think, the film is, I think, overall not particularly sympathetic towards its victims. Its emphasis here is on the detectives, and we are invited to respond to their response, to their reactions. And it's notable, Mills isn't the only one who's contemptuous towards the gluttony victim. The police captain as well says, oh, come on, somebody had a problem with a fat boy and killed him.
Yes.
And that's it. That victim is only ever referred to as fat boy.
Fat boy. And also, like, it's, to him, that's a justification, that is a motive. And I'm just like, you're the captain or chief of police. I don't know what his actual role is, but, high up. And you think that that's like a, oh, that's the case. That's it. It's just someone had a problem with a fat person and brutally tortured them to death. And if I'm honest, I do understand where the captain's coming from when Somerset says this is just beginning, because he's right. There's one body. Like, where are you getting that from? But obviously, we know as rewatchers that Somerset's intuition is spot on. But as the captain, like, I totally agree with his point of view, which is, you're exaggerating. You're reading too much into this. Your big brain. You turn off that big brain. He says, right. And again, it's that we get a window into how he's treated in this department. He's treated as this person who thinks outside of the box. What's in the box? And he's admired by the captain. I actually thought like he was his strongest ally. He seemed to like him, where
he refers to him as old buddy at one point.
Old buddy, he does. And where like the beat cops are a lot more, not argumentative, but a lot more stern with him and not willing to do like what he needs them to do. So yeah, so to our point, so they get the man into the autopsy room, the gluttony victim, I should say. And they say something like, Mills says, how does someone let themselves go like that? And then the coroner says it took 4 orderlies to get him on the table. And then that's when he says, how'd the fat fuck get out his front door? And Somerset says, please, it's obvious he was a shut-in.
Yeah.
And then they question, like, did he eat until he burst? And the coroner says no, he was hemorrhaging internally. And then they hypothesize that what happened was he passed out, and well, we now know John Doe, but the murderer kicked him, which caused the stomach to burst because it was just so full of content. I want to point out at this point the makeup that went into this scene. So the actor who plays the gluttony victim is a man called Rob Bottin. I don't know what size he naturally is, but for the sake of the film, he led development of practical effects.
Bob Mack is the actor who played the gluttony victim. Yeah, Rob Bottin is a renowned makeup artist.
That's correct. My mistake. I just need to read further down my notes. So yes, on my notes. So Rob Bottin researched crime scene photos and police evidence filed, and to understand the effects that kind of decay would take on like an obese body. And then for gluttony, Bob Mack, as you say, spent 19 hours a day in makeup. Is it 19 or 9? I don't know if that's a typo. Must be 9. Can't be 19. It's Hannah from editing. So Bob Mack, who is the actor who plays Gluttony, spent 10 hours in makeup to get the appropriate prosthetics on to play the gluttony victim. Not 9 or 19. I have no idea what happened with my notes. So I just want to correct myself. It was 10 hours. Speak to you all later. Hours a day in makeup and prosthetics. He had a scuba-like device so he could keep his head down in the spaghetti bowl. And then there was bugs all over him, there's cockroaches in the scene, and he didn't know that was going to happen. So that's sad. And apparently Brad Pitt would keep flicking off the bugs off his body while he had to stay motionless. And then in the autopsy scene, they used a fiberglass replica. And David Fincher said that they had that fiberglass replica made with a deliberately enlarged penis because he felt bad for Bob Mack because he spent so long in makeup for 30 seconds of screen time, and I quote, "At least I could give him a huge cock."
The funny thing being that cock is maybe on screen for 1/30th of a second.
Yeah, but the thing is, I read that and then I watched the scene and I was like, oh, it is like predominant, like, yeah, okay. But there's an interesting, I think I'm picking up on a trend here. So have you seen the show Parks and Recreation?
I have not.
Okay, so there is a large character in that show called Jerry, and he's a larger man, and he is like the butt of the joke within the office environment. And apparently the writers on that show said that they felt so bad about how they were constantly mocking Jerry. He was clumsy, he was unlucky, that they decided the only way that they could like make themselves feel better is if they canonically made it clear that his character had a big penis. And so it comes up because he's gone to like a doctor's appointment and the doctor says, I have no idea whether Jerry has the mumps because he has the largest penis I've ever seen. And that's now canon. And I was like thinking at the time, like, oh, that feels really weird. Like, why is that like redemption for taking the mick out of this larger character for X amount of years of writing? And then you've kind of atoned for your sins by giving the character a large penis. And then I see here they did the exact same thing for this large character. And I'm just wondering, I'm a woman, I don't understand the penis envy. But I'm just like, is that something that like do you have any comment on that, Vincent? I'll put you on the spot here.
I think it's a very sort of, I think, crude way of approaching the issue. The idea here is that being fat is a misfortune. Yes. Being well hung is a boon. So that's, I think, we're trying to balance the cosmic scales here.
Yeah.
Now, men like to talk about how, big our cocks are. I'm not going to discuss my own role in that.
I thank you. I thank you for that.
It is a terrible cliche, really. The whole idea of how do men literally measuring up against each other. It's like, this is the time to measure dick size. By that, do you mean bank account size?
Yeah.
Do you mean car size? Ooh, what are you compensating for?
Exactly. So yeah.
But what's interesting in this context, well, both the contexts we've got here, both in Parks and Recreation and Seven, we give the guy a huge dick because, oh, poor fellow, he's really fat.
Yeah.
In the context of Seven, David Fincher wanting that because he felt bad for Bob Mack because of all the work he was putting in for, not a great deal of screen time. But it can also work in the sense of, well, everything about this guy is big.
Yes, yeah.
But weirdly, thinking about the way, when we see the gluttony victim naked on the autopsy table, you see if he's well endowed, fair enough. I haven't looked closely enough, but even so, he is still very much this figure of pitifulness and of grotesquerie. His body on there is presented as revolting.
Yeah,
that's in terms of how the audience are invited to respond, and the way the characters in general respond to him. Of course, later on, when John Doe is listing his various victims, he describes this obese man who is disgusting to be mocked, who is so sickening that if you saw him, you wouldn't be able to finish your meal. And again, it's like, seems a bit excessive.
It
but
does,
at the same,
yeah.
But at the same time, the film is kind of it is inviting that perspective, that we could look at them and at this enormous. But there's a question, I suppose: are we finding this figure grotesque because he's fat, or because this is a dead person or because he's dead and decomposing? It's, I mean, in fairness, in that case, it's probably a combination.
I was going to say, I think it's a combination. I think when we get to sloth, which is at the other end of the body extreme, it's the same. It's inviting the same reaction, but for I mean the pun here, the opposite end of the scale, because you have a very emancipated man, emaciated man, and yeah, so we've got it's interesting how we have two victims of like opposite ends of the spectrum of weight, and the reaction or the audience reaction should be, we should be revolted, we should be disgusted. I think there's a sense of shame as well, especially with gluttony. I think you're meant to feel like ashamed of him, for him, because again, to Mills's point, how does someone let themselves go to that? Like, how do you let yourself go there? Somerset says he was a shut-in, so he was ashamed to let himself be seen by others because he knew the judgment that would, befall him. If that's true, again, they don't know, they're hypothesizing. And I think that's what, as an audience member, you're meant to feel like, oh, I get that. Like, if I was that fat, I would be ashamed. I wouldn't want to be seen out in public. And the film is inviting you to not only empathize on that level of like disgust, but also agree with gluttony's reasons for staying hidden.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's I mean, I would say in the case of Somerset's deduction that he was a shut-in, I suspect that was also to do with other elements of the apartment where they found him, in terms of the windows being blacked out, the two televisions, supplies in there.
I was going to say that the two televisions I thought was very interesting, because again, it's this idea of like he was TV obsessed, couch potato, laziness, and I was like, well, that's another interesting parallel they're adding to this character. I did query whether, like, how much, I mean, the TVs, I totally agree, was the victim, but whether the blackout windows was meant to be John Doe, or whether that was the victim doing that to shield himself from the world. I didn't know, and I don't think it doesn't actually necessarily matter, because both make sense in the grander scheme, but it did pop into my head.
There is a pattern here, interestingly, but I think there is a pattern of fat representation on screen in relation to shut-ins. I think you've, on your list of like future films, you're going to talk about The Whale.
I will do, yes.
Which features a shut-in. Also, do you, or are you familiar with the film What's Eating Gilbert Grape?
I knew you were going to say What's Eating Gilbert Grape in that moment. So okay. I'm aware of the mum character in that one.
Also a shut-in who never moves from the TV, watching the TV on the couch.
Yeah.
So I think in that respect, when Somerset says obviously a shut-in, I think that he's that line put in there by Andrew Kevin Walker, sort of drawing on cultural understandings of people like that. And it does, you're absolutely right, tie to the idea of the shame of being big, of being fat, of being obese, that it is something you that is to be looked upon with a certain amount of shame. Okay, and to stay with David Fincher, you kind of get that in Fight Club with a character of Bob, played by
Meatloaf?
the late great Meatloaf.
Rest in peace, absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely. I saw Meatloaf in concert like 8 times.
I'm so sorry. That must have been a real shock for you then when he went.
Yeah, it was a bit.
Yeah.
To be fair, he was quite elderly. Anyway, but in Fight Club, Meatloaf's character Bob is, he's very much somebody who is ashamed of his body. In his case, his body has become feminized because he's got, as they call them, bitch tits.
Yes, they do.
But he is,
course.
yeah, but he is clearly very much, afflicted by shame. And I think we could read the same into the fat man in Se7en, the gluttony victim. And interestingly, the more I think about him, the more empathy, the more sympathy I feel for him. It's like, oh, poor guy.
Totally.
He didn't need to eat a salad. He didn't need to go to a gym. The guy needed a hug. The guy needed company. The last thing he needed was some fucker sticking a gun in his face and saying, eat, 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 eat. To be fair, none of us need that.
None of us need that. But also, now we're talking, how did John Doe know of him? If he's a shut-in, like they say, how did he pop up on John Doe's radar?
Good question, I suppose. Yeah.
I guess you could ask that. I mean, the other ones are a bit more obvious because they are in the public eye to a certain degree.
Yes.
Bar maybe Lust and Pride, which we'll get into. So the next
Pride certainly would have been.
So let's get there later. Why do you think the film starts with gluttony? Because when they start looking into the text of the deadly sins, is that the right word? Yeah,
deadly sins.
I instantly went, that's not what it's called. Yes, it is. They reference Dante's Purgatory, and Mills says, but the first terrace is pride. So why is he starting with gluttony? And Somerset something like, he's taking influence. He's not doing it verbatim. But why would the film choose for gluttony to be the first victim?
I think that's largely a structural aspect. I remember seeing interview Andrew Kevin Walker saying that serial killer narratives are brilliant for screenwriters because it gives you this very straightforward structure. Victim investigation works just fine. And I think the way having the gluttony be the first victim interestingly does add to the anonymity, because when they first find the victim, Somerset doesn't discover gluttony written at the crime scene until after they've found the second crime scene, which is greed.
Yes.
So I think in that respect, that first crime scene comes across it allows the mystery to kind of be developed, because it's like, firstly, they're not even sure it's murder. Secondly, they're not entirely sure how this is a homicide. And then there's the thing about Somerset saying that this isn't this is not a standard murder. This is because of this takes purpose. The act itself has meaning. So I think it's a matter of giving the audience an increasing sense that there is more to this than may immediately appear. And notably, of course, when Mills then goes to deal with, initially they're both assigned to this case. Mills is reassigned to investigate another case, which turns out to be the greed victim, and then it turns out, oh look, they're connected. Who'd have thought it?
I know.
And I think, but that one is a lot more blatant, because the word greed is not hidden. So I would say that's why. But I think it is interesting that it is the most anonymous victim. That yes, he may have been a shut-in, so indeed, how did John Doe find out about him? Well, maybe Doe happened to see him on the street a couple of years ago and was like, oh God, that man is so fat, I want to kill him. And then sort of, kept, and then found where he lived. And then when the time was right, okay, fella, you're going to eat until I say otherwise.
Yeah, possibly.
So I think that's why we start with gluttony.
I totally hear your point. And as well, potentially to, I think because gluttony's victim is so, to what we've been saying, it's grim. And I think I can only imagine in 95 or 96, whenever you did watch this, it was quite shocking to see something so grotesque and revolting. And I think it sets the tone for what the film's going to be. And
absolutely.
And the thing is, it's not so gory that it would turn people off straight away. Like, say, for example, if they switched it with Sloth, You need to like ramp up to that. But yeah, I think I totally agree. I think there's a few different things at play, and I think mainly it's narratively, but it also sets up that tension between Somerset and Mills, and we really see the differences in their approach to detective work. And so let me get into that then. So you mentioned there we go into Greed on the Tuesday, and it's a defense attorney named Eli Gold. So this is our first named victim.
Mm-hmm.
And Greed is written in blood. And what I find really interesting about this moment is Mills asks the other cops to leave the room so he could be there on his own. And I felt that was very much him trying to take something from Somerset and just sit there in silence and try and look at the different angles. And I thought already he's trying to like follow in his footsteps. Did you catch that or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He asks the other he tells the other cops to leave the forensic team, and then yes, he sits down in the and it looks like he's sort of absorbing the scene himself as he
Yes.
kind of imagines Somerset does. Because I would
Mm,
expect, just to go into, I guess, the backstory of both characters,
mhm.
Mills will have probably, read a lot of Somerset's cases and understands that Somerset is a great detective.
Yes, well, he
Um,
says, you read my file, which indicates he's read Somerset's file.
mm. To
So,
which Somerset is like, nope.
no,
Why would I? I'm leaving.
no, exactly. He's so checked out. He's like, why would I do that? Uh, and the thing is, like, this case is so compelling because of like just the nature. Obviously, these people are being killed, and then you get the deadly sins element into it. You can see like Somerset be like, I can't get into this. I can't get into this. But of course, he can't help himself. He goes to the library to start reading up on the literature around the deadly sins. And actually, this is the first moment I noticed peace. So when he walks into the library, he obviously knows the security guards who are there playing poker, and we don't hear any more sirens. We've got classical music instead. There's no one else around. There's no chaos because even in like the precinct, there's chaos. There's things all over all the desks. Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting, kind of parallel, and I really felt like this was Somerset's safe place. And I guess the security guards are aware that he's retiring, so they might not see him anymore. And I wonder whether he would. I can imagine even if he did retire, he'd still do that because like that's his little safe space to go when he can't sleep.
Except well, yes, quite possibly. Something that was in sort of some deleted scenes
Oh,
um,
okay.
is that Somerset isn't just leaving the police; he's leaving the city.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Now, in some of the deleted scenes, there are actually points where he's looking around a house out in the country, which weirdly looks a lot like some of the scenes we see of Morgan Freeman towards the very end of the Shawshank Redemption. But that's literally another
Oh,
story. Um,
yeah.
Having said that, none of this is in the film itself, so we
Hmm.
don't necessarily have to say it, except for two little hints.
Okay.
One of them being that in the very opening scene, when Somerset is preparing his equipment, as it were, for the day, like his gun and his badge and his switchblade, he's also got this little patch of what turns out is actually, within the wider context, a bit of wallpaper. It's a little bit of wallpaper that he can put up in his new home. And perhaps the one explicit point, when he gets in the taxi to go to the library, he said
Hmm.
the cab driver asks him, "Where are you heading?"
Hmm.
And Somerset's reply is, "Far away from here."
Yes.
So he is on his way out of the city as well. Notable, of course, how the film ends, perhaps. Um,
Mm.
but I do think, I do find you're absolutely right describing the library scene as peaceful.
Hmm.
And it's also interesting in terms of looking sort of in the moment, but also backwards, because we have
Mm.
this montage of Somerset in the library reading
Yes.
through what turns out to be the inspiration for the killer. But we also see Mills at home looking
Hmm.
at crime scene photographs. Although we don't see the gluttony victim again, we do see pictures of him.
Hmm.
Again, looking, pretty ghastly. To be fair, he is dead. And so it's a matter of Mills is very much about that immediacy, the immediacy of the photograph, the moment literally captured in time. While Somerset is looking back, he's looking, towards the inspiration, towards the history, towards the, and as he says, culture, as the
Mm-hmm.
guards rather say, hey, we've got culture playing the
Yes.
classical music, which
Yes.
again kind of echoes the Shawshank Redemption, I suppose.
That's a good
uh,
point.
yeah.
I think as well, like this is definitely we have already got a taste of their different approaches to the job, but here we really see kind of the differences in how their minds work. So Mills is very much like to your point, like he's like, well, this is the case, so I'm looking at the case.
Mm-hmm.
Where Somerset clearly is a very well educated person and is, a researcher of some type who's like, oh, well, there's got to be some kind of motive here. Let's go into the motive. Let's understand, where these deadly sins come from. And he's coming from a place of, I want to help. But it's interesting because he gives a note to Mills to say, look at these texts. And the next day we see that Mills has asked one of the cops to go get the cliff notes
Yep.
of is it Canterbury Tales and
Paradise Lost, Dante's
yes,
Inferno. Yeah, because we see Mills trying to read some of it, then he
yes,
gives up very quickly.
very quickly.
Speaking as an academic, I very
Mm-hmm.
much applaud Somerset's meticulous approach to research, and seeing Mills go for the easy approach. I'm like, oh dear me, that's not going to be an interesting essay to mark.
Yeah, exactly. I've just realized when I'm looking at my notes, I've missed one of my favorite lines of the film. It's when they're in the kind of the bullpen of all the different desks, and the captain is there, and it rings, and he answers like, "This ain't even my desk," and shuts it down. And there's some really good little one-liners like that, like just speckled
Yeah.
into the film. Which again, going back to your buddy cop kind of analogy, you would have that in those films, and in some ways it gives you a bit of levity in this incredibly dark film.
Yeah, the
um
best point being, I mean, I'm jumping ahead slightly here,
no, go for it.
when Somerset is invited for dinner at the
Yes,
Mills's home, and
yes.
they're sitting there having they've had the nice dinner, and then the place vibrates. And
Yes, yes.
Somerset describes it as soothing, relaxing, vibrating house, and they all burst out laughing.
It's so good. And they're like really laughing. I think it's the only time we see that. Like, it's definitely the only time we see Somerset smile, let his guard down. And we are going to get into that scene quickly. Because we find that, he's reading the cliff notes. They're now in each other's office, and Tracy, Gwyneth Paltrow's character, has rings up her husband and is like, "Put me on with your partner, I guess."
Yeah.
And I just love this. I don't know, this confidence from Tracy. Like, I know they're not talking because I know my husband and I know cops, right? And she has to be this mediator between the two. And she invites him round, and she goes, "I've heard so much about you, but I don't know your first name." And that's when we find out that Somerset's first name is William and Mills's first name is David. And she says, "William meet David, David meet William. Like, you are people." And I find this watch that I was really watching Tracy, because I want to understand, in a film where there's not many women, what
Indeed.
what is Tracy's role here? And she just seems to be this light, this potential light, this potential like virtue in this dark, apathetic city. And she's like a nurturer, clearly. She's a mediator, she's a teacher, she's going to be a mother. And I find it really interesting, just even like she says things like, "I don't like guns." I don't like guns. And Somerset says, "Yeah, same here." She asks him why has he never found a relationship, someone similar to herself, I guess, that she is for Mills. And we get a bit more backstory. He was close once. He was obviously had some kind of relationship at some point, but it didn't work out. I mean, it's very clear that Tracy doesn't like the city. And she's
You
only
think?
been, yeah, she's been there a few days.
Mm,
And she already doesn't like the city. So why is Tracy important to these two characters bonding?
Well, I think you used the most important term already. She is a mediator.
Mm-hmm.
She also represents what ostensibly both of them do this job for. I mean, why else do cops do the things that they do? Well, okay, some of them probably do it. Well, I've done a lot of research and writing into cop movies. There are various reasons as to why it's done, but I guess the romanticized reason that police officers do what they do, at least within movies, is to protect the innocent, and that is
Of
what
course.
Tracy represents. We spoke earlier about the innocence of children,
Yes.
but Tracy isn't exactly, she's not desperately naive because she recognizes all the horrible things around her, but she is so resistant to it. She wants to be away from it. I think it's interesting that you use the term light, which is fascinating. There is a really great book written about Seven.
Oh,
It's
okay.
from it's in the series of books from the British Film Institute, BFI Classics.
Mm-hmm.
It's written by Richard Dyer, who's a very respected academic. And as well as writing a book about Seven, he also wrote a book all about film stars. He was, was quite famous for that, his book called Stars. And a big part of that book is to do with lighting. I'm sorry, no, it wasn't. He wrote a book called Stars. He also wrote a book called Race. That's the one I'm talking about.
Okay.
And in that book, he talked extensively about the way white actors and actors of color are lit.
Wow. Okay.
Similarly, he talks about the way Gwyneth Paltrow is lit in Seven, and in a film that is predominantly not only thematically but also literally dark.
Yes.
We were talking earlier about critical response. There were some critics who actually complained about the film, saying, I couldn't see what was going on.
Yeah.
But when Tracy is on screen, we see her. She is lit in such a way to let us know what she represents. Note also, at the first crime scene, Somerset finds a quotation from Paradise Lost. Long is the way and hard that up from hell leads up to light. So that is what Tracy represents, I think. She represents the light. She represents what our, in inverted commas, heroes are fighting for. And notably, and therefore, of course, which makes her death all the more devastating, because it's like, well, there's a light snuffed out very easily. Now, in terms of representation of women, the film is not great. I mean, let's face it, mainstream cinema in general, not great in terms of representation of women. In that there is a common tendency to present women in these largely symbolic terms, not as having much in the way of character, not having much in the way of they only really exist in relation to the men. Tracy's purpose in the film is to be a wife and to not be a mother, as it turns out, and to be a victim. It's, if you get any movie that actually manages to give you a set of women that are detailed, and that is a rare thing. One of your previous episodes spoke about Bridesmaids, which does that aspect wonderfully. So Seven is a product of its time, but also a product of the patriarchy in that regard. It was a bit rich coming from me. Here's I'm a beneficiary of the patriarchy every day, but I will call myself out on it.
I was going to say, we have to call out our privilege when we see it. Otherwise, there's no point. We have to be allies where we need to be. So I appreciate you saying all that, because I totally agree. I find Tracy's storyline in this really, really sad, actually. Again, it's something I didn't appreciate before. Because again, I probably was just a bit of a gore hound, and I was like, oh, what a great twist. But reading it now with this, I'm in my 30s now, families all around me, kids, and I just see Tracy as this really tragic figure in the story for obvious reasons. But then also, I actually think Gwyneth Paltrow plays her so well. As much as that, she isn't given a lot, what she does do, I find really poignant. So the scene where, she's so honest with Somerset and to let her know like she doesn't like living in the city. What could she do? Because she goes to Somerset, someone who's lived there for decades at this point, almost like, does it get better? And Somerset again is very honest back, meets her honesty with his honesty and says that, yeah, no, like, I didn't want to bring a child into this world. That's how negative I see it. But then he says like, if you do decide to not continue the pregnancy, never tell Mills. But if you do decide to keep it, spoil the child, rot it. And they both tear up at that moment. It's a really lovely scene. And again, like I really applaud Gwyneth for being able to bring that kind of sentimentality to her role, which is not given a lot. But yeah, I think again, kind of bring it back to the deadly sins for a second. So if she's the opposite of a deadly sin, so she's like a cardinal virtue. One of the cardinal virtues is temperance. And it's almost like the opposite of gluttony, right? So this idea of like you moderate. And I found that word when I was looking at it earlier. I was like, well, moderation really, really comes into play with diet culture. So if you're ever on a diet or if you've been on any kind of weight loss thing, they'll say, oh, we can have it all in moderation, right? And there is a real line between diet culture, patriarchy, how women are expected to be within their families, be the kind of moral guiding light of the family, of the home, of wherever they are. They're like the emotional bearers, they're the teachers, they're the nurturers, everything that Tracy is in this film. And yet I couldn't help but notice, like, again, to your point, like, she really is a product of the patriarchy that she's in, not only her as a character, but how she has been written.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Se7en is a film written, produced, directed by men, and therefore utilizing the figure of woman in. Oh, that'll do. That's how.
That'll do.
I mean, I don't want to be quite so vicious to say that these men are saying, well, that's what women are, but I think it's more along the lines of thinking that's how women work in movies. Yeah. In the sense of think of a patriarchal product intended for an assumed patriarchal audience. It's always baffling, I think, that historically women were recognized as a very significant audience. And, there's the idea of from the 1930s, Hollywood produced what was known as the woman's film, which were, funnily enough, successful. And yet somewhere along the line, and by somewhere along the line, I think it was kind of in the 1970s, cinema Hollywood cinema anyway, seemed to assume a predominantly male audience, which is bad for business. I mean, come on, you don't alienate half the population. In that way, you'll make more money. And yet we do see these interesting incorporations of here's how we can do something which might appeal to the female audience. I was looking up actually what all of the cardinal virtues are: wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, faith, hope, and love. And I think, you could find those. I mean, you could find hope, I think, and love, certainly, as well as temperance in Tracy. You could argue that both Mills and Somerset have an element of courage, and definitely. Certainly Somerset has wisdom and justice.
Yes.
Then how about faith? Not much of that. There's certainly very little faith and hope.
No, but then I guess that's John Doe's whole point, right?
Yes,
is that we're in a godless society, so that makes sense actually. So we'll move on from Tracy, and we find that Somerset and Mills are like doing some work at home. They're looking through the crime scene photos of Greed, and they realize it's a pound of flesh. He was forced to cut off, some part of his body and put it on the scales.
Notably, Mills is again scornful and dismissive, and refers to what did our Greed victim cut off? A love handle.
Love handle, yeah.
So another reference to fatness.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well.
And again, it's interesting because there is that moment where they question whether the police will work just as hard as any other murder case because it's a defense attorney who arguably works against the DA. And then again, you hear this, again, apathy, this lack of compassion from Mills towards this victim. It's just like, if the press heard you, mate, you have a field day. So we
Which is
got.
interesting considering the later photograph.
Oh, yes, exactly that. So we'll get there soon. So they find that there's a picture of the defense attorney's wife on the wall. It has red circles around it, made little blood circles around her eyes. So they go and talk to her, and she looks through the crime scene photos and says, this painting is upside down. Must be a clue. So they go to the painting, they can't figure it out, and then it's not until again Somerset, using like his instinct, dusts the wall behind the painting, and he finds prints that spell out, is it help me?
Help me, that's right.
Help me.
Notably, you've got the print, the fingerprint tech guy. He's doing his thing on the wall. This is pre CSI, but not long pre CSI.
No, yeah, Prince Lab,
yeah, doing his thing, and he says, "Well, these are not the fingerprints of the victim." And interestingly, Mills asks Somerset, "Have you ever seen anything like this?" And Somerset's like, "Nope,
no."
So if you think about, me neither. I can't think of any other movie that has used the device of a message written in fingerprints.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. No, not off the top of my head, but maybe I need to Google that later. They get a hit. They get a hit on the prints, and it's this man called Theodore Victor Allen, who is a drug dealer and pedophile, and he was his lawyer was Eli Gold. So this is our first connection between the victims, which I think is very interesting. While they're on the way to the latest residence of Victor, because they're like, this is definitely him, this is definitely him. I love their confidence here. Mills and Somerset have a conversation in the car about their gun and whether or not they've ever had to pull out their gun and fire it. And Somerset says he's only ever had to pull out his gun 3 times, and he's never fired it. I think that conversation actually starts with, have you ever taken a shot, like actually taken a bullet? And then it goes into like, have you ever fired your gun? And we find that Somerset has very rarely taken out his gun and has never fired his gun. And then we have Mills say that he's taken out his gun, is it 3 times or something like that? And he has shot someone once when he was a rookie. And you can see he can't remember the person's name. And I find it very interesting.
Well, I think crucially, he's talking about he was with another officer, and the other officer was shot.
Yes, in the arm.
He's trying to remember. Yeah.
Yes, but Somerset looks almost horrified to hear that this man has, witnessed this thing, and not only that, can't remember the name. And it's like he can't, like, he doesn't respect the human life, that he can't even remember this person's name, that he almost died.
Possibly. Okay, I read it differently. I got the sense
what's your reading?
That seemed to me like an important bonding moment between them, because Mills is clearly distressed over this. I mean, he's trying to remember the guy's name, and he feels really bad, I think, that he can't. And I think that's Somerset thinking like, yeah, I get that. That's tough.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, no, fair. I mean, both could be true, right? We don't know. So we get to the apartment, or the block of flats that it's in, and the SWAT team go in first. And someone said something like, they love this, when they like bash down the door.
Yes, it does.
And they run in.
Speaking of guys waving their dicks around.
Well, this is the thing, because the SWAT team call for detectives. Dicks, get in here. And yeah, we've got the SWAT led by John C. McGinley, or Dr. Cox. I can't ever see him as anything else. They find a room filled with those car air fresheners, the tree ones, and they come in. The detectives come in, and they're shouting at the man like, "Get up!" And they think they pull off the sheet, and they think he's dead. He must be. This man is completely just skin and bone, sores all over him. I think he must be bound. Oh, go on.
Yeah, he is. He is. Yeah, he's strapped to the bed. Although one of the SWAT team says it's some kind of friggin' wax sculpture. They don't even think it's a body.
Oh, I missed that. Good point. Yeah, that's how like unhuman this person looks. And yeah, they go up to him, like, and again, like, it's like he doesn't even have a mouth anymore. It just looks like it's just gums. It really is, back to the word we use for gluttony, grotesque. It really is awful. Like, oh my God, how does someone get to this point? It must be like been decomposing for ages. How did no one know? And obviously, then you see the air fresheners disguising the smell. And Dr. Cox, sorry, I don't know what is his name. California in this.
California,
Yeah,
yes. The
California. So
SWAT
California's
captain.
yeah, SWAT captain goes up and he gets right into his face and says, "You deserve this," which again is very interesting. And then that's when we get this jump scares of all jump scares, where he like the sloth. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
it's
I think we all
horrible.
jump out of our skin at that point.
Yeah, they all jump back, and we realize that this skeleton of a person is still alive, barely, barely alive. And obviously, they call the ambulance and they come in. And I just again, it is a jump scare to end all jump scares. And I quickly looked at again how they created this man, created this victim. So for Sloth, they spent 11 days experimenting with prosthetics to get the right look with the actor Michael Reed McKay. He was 5'5" and he weighed 45 kilos. So he's a very light man. And they actually asked him to lose more weight, which I think is insane. So his BMI as it is he's already, I mean, I know the BMI is trash, but he's already considered underweight. So the fact that they asked him to lose more, I just think is really like irresponsible. But
Too
anyway,
bad Christian Bale was busy.
oh well, one day he's probably going to come up on this podcast at some point. So they went the makeup route, and the makeup took 14 hours a day to apply. And the actor, what's his name? Sorry, Michael Reed McKay. He said that it was a very strenuous experience. You know, the fact that like when he's in the room, he's not able to move, barely able to breathe because obviously he's meant to look dead. And he actually said that when he would when he's coughs to scare California, that was actually a relief for him because finally he can breathe, you know. And he also says that they had to keep hosing him down with water, which made him cold. And you're just like, oh, this poor man. Commitment to the craft, I tell
Oh,
you.
yeah, totally.
Yeah. So like what are your thoughts when you can you remember what you first thought of when you saw this scene?
Oh, yeah. It was, I think it was a combination of, I mean, when we first see Victor, when we get
Mm-hmm.
the sheet pulled off him, it's just a matter of, oh, God, that's horrendous.
Yeah.
And then the point when we get the jump scare, if it turns out he's still alive, that was complete shock. It's shock, it's horror, it's, you know, disbelief. It's like, wait, what? Huh?
Yeah.
And then we don't stay there. You know, we cut away fairly quickly to the hospital where
Mm-hmm.
we get the doctor giving again a fairly unsympathetic assessment of him. The doctors are like, well, you know, his brain is mush. He chewed off his tongue. He's suffered as much pain and suffering as anyone I've seen, and he's got hell to look forward to. Like,
Yes.
wow,
Yeah.
huh,
Yeah. And
grim.
I, that's it. Like, you know, this is potentially the worst case he's ever seen. But interestingly, with this victim, we get a really clear understanding of why he would be targeted. You know, if
Yes.
we look at legality, so if you look at gluttony, they in John Doe's opinion ate too much, overconsumed, and it became too fat for his liking. With greed, you know, he's a defense attorney, so he got, I think to his point, murderers and rapists off scot free, and he takes money for that. And then we get to Sloth, and this man is a drug dealer and pedophile who didn't serve the time he should have done for his crimes because his lawyer was greed. And again, California really reiterates that by saying like, you deserve this. You don't deserve to live. Like you're a bad man. And yet he's given arguably like one of the worst, most torturous fates, and no one empathizes, or should they empathize? Again, I guess it challenges your morals as an audience member of like, okay, where's the line? Because this person's clearly not a good egg, but no one should be treated this way, surely.
Because bear in mind, of course, his torture has been going on for a year.
A
He has
year.
been strapped to that bed for a year, kept
Yes.
alive, but
hand cut off.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
so John Doe could spread his prints where he needed to. And again, Mills is very naive in this moment, saying like, "Oh, it's just luck. It's just luck that we got there on the day." Like, and Somerset's like, "No, this is planned. This is meticulously planned. We are just following what we're meant to be following." And
Somerset describes the killer as methodical,
methodical.
exacting, and worst of all, patient.
Yes, exactly that. And again, patience is a virtue, right?
It's not one of these cardinal virtues, I
Oh,
don't
is it
think,
not? Is it not?
unless
I'm just
unless it's a
quoting the mummy.
unless it's unless it's a synonym for temperance, I suppose.
Oh, maybe.
But yeah, but absolutely, he is dangerously patient.
Yeah, dangerous patient. I never fully understood why this victim is considered the deadly sin of sloth.
True. I suppose it's a matter of perhaps was he also a drug taker as well as a
I,
drug
I,
dealer?
I think that is implied because I,
Yeah.
I, I think John Doe might say that in his, final explanation. He might explain, I think he says something. Oh, I
Well, he
have to I
says he's
have
a
to Google
drug
it.
dealer, a drug dealing pederast,
Pederast, yes, that's the word. Yeah, but
but
that's
but
obviously
that's another word
no.
for paedophile.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the impression I got that Sloth Victor was a junkie.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that makes sense. Then we're back at the crime scene, I believe, and there's a photographer comes in because obviously he's paid off someone to get in because that's how the media works in this city. And Mills gets so angry and frustrated, he's screaming at this guy like, "Get out of my face, get out of here!" Blah, blah. And
Yeah, he's kind of wrathful. Ooh,
yeah.
spoiler.
But and it's interesting because Somerset says like, it's interesting to watch a man feed off his emotions. And
Yes.
again, looking at the two of them, we have Somerset who's very logical, and we have Mills who's very close to emotions. And again, it's a very there's that thing where they say men don't believe that their emotions are actually logic, so they don't see anger as an emotion. And again, I
Yeah.
think with Mills, I actually really understand his reaction in that moment. I think I would have been angry too.
Mm-hmm.
But Somerset is like, I don't know, it's always just kind of like, calm back, focus on the task at hand. Don't just have a go at some random photographer, like don't let it out on him. We've got to get back to the task. Would you have got angry in that moment?
Angry at the photographer, yes, I
Mm-hmm.
completely get that. Interestingly, that comes after Mills is showing a lot of anger and frustration about the case. I mean, that's I
Uh,
mean,
yeah.
Somerset says that we need to divorce ourselves from emotion, which makes
Mm-hmm.
sense because in the context of methodical police work, emotion can cloud judgment.
Mm.
Um, and to be fair, I think Mills's judgment is dubious at best anyway. Um,
Yeah.
however, but I suppose it is very interesting thinking about what happens later in the film that we
Mm.
find that should we spoil this now?
We can
Yeah,
spoil.
right.
Let's go for it.
That the photographer
Mm.
is actually John Doe.
Yes.
And we find this out later. That's who he was. Mills refers to it, the fucking photographer on the fucking stairs. But it is
Yeah.
interesting that um, John Doe appears, takes the photo, he makes Mills very angry, and that is the climax of the film. That
Mm-hmm.
John Doe makes Mills so angry that Mills becomes the final victim, Wrath.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting. We don't know it at the time, but it is a foreshadowing of the
Definitely.
finale,
Definitely is a foreshadowing.
and
Uh
yet reasonable. I think, even
yeah.
though, yeah, I think Mills is, even though we may not entirely admire Mills throughout, I think all of his reactions are very understandable and very human. We
Yes,
might like to think, oh yes, yes, totally. I'd be like Somerset. I'd be all calm, cool, and reserved.
I
Would you
wouldn't.
though? Would
No,
you?
I truly wouldn't. I know that, and I know myself enough to be like, no, I would be so quick to anger, especially in that moment, especially three victims down, no closer to the killer. You know, being made of a mockery because you are literally following the killer's plan. Like you are not in any way ahead of the game. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in that moment, like they're so aware of that. They are so aware that they are made no progress. And so we move into Friday, and that's when Tracy asks Somerset to meet her down at the diner, and we hear that she's pregnant and she doesn't know what to do. Then we go back to the police station, and Mills and Somerset are reviewing their evidence, and Mills, again, very much still in his anger, starts calling the killer a lunatic. He's crazy, he's insane. And Somerset's really imploring him to, don't be so dismissive. Like that, you don't underestimate this man. He's already 3 down. If he manages to complete his plan, he will got another 4. We can't just, I don't know, there's something so patronizing. I'm not saying that John Doe isn't clinically insane. I'm just saying it's patronizing to think of him as just a crazy, just a lunatic. And I also thought it really undermines the deaths of the victims as well, because it's like, oh, well, they fell trap to this lunatic, it's like, but you're falling into the trap, Mills. This is projection.
Yeah. I'll just drop a quick little fun fact about this.
Yeah.
Mills says, this killer's a nutbag. Just because the fucker's got a library card doesn't make him Yoda. David Fincher, one of David Fincher's earliest films that he worked on was The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, what did he do on that one?
I think he was like a second camera operator, something like that.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, that's it. David Fincher remembering his roots.
Yeah. But of course, it's important that he says that Mills uses the phrase library card, because that takes us into our next development.
Exactly that. So that's when Somerset goes like, well, let's have a field trip. How much money have you got? I've got $50. And they're sitting, again, it's like a pizzeria, and they're sitting in a booth, but side by side. And we have a little bit of gay panic where Mills is like, I don't want people to think that we're dating, very 90s. And this man walks in and clearly knows Somerset, but says, oh, I didn't know it's going to be a menage a trois. Somerset passes this man a brown envelope with a list of books and some money, and he says it'll be about an hour, and he goes. And I think Mills says, oh, that was a waste of time. I was like, Mills,
well, he says
patience.
Money well spent.
Money well spent. Sorry. Yes, money well spent. I was like, patience. You don't know what's happening. And then they go and sit in a barber shop. And that's when Somerset explains like things like, I trust you because I'm going to explain my, my secrets. Like who am I in cahoots with? And we find out that the man that he gave the money to works for the FBI, and the FBI have tabs on certain books that are checked out in libraries, because some books, if they get checked out, they're going to flag up of like a nefarious or potential nefarious activity. So they have records of what people have checked out, and Mills is like, that's illegal.
Yep. Also true.
Yeah,
check this out. This does happen.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it, because that collection of information about that's an early form of big data. I mean, these days your 100%. Library checkouts would be the tip of the iceberg. It's like your internet browsing history.
Absolutely.
And particularly you think about Department of Homeland Security, anti-terrorism measures, so much monitoring of what people are accessing. Look at this, somebody has been checking out lots of books and accessing lots of websites about mixing about how to make nitroglycerin, dear, and so on. It's remarkable there.
To the FBI agent who's currently watching our call, we are just talking about a film. Please don't have us.
We're really not worth your time.
No, it's fine. We're talking about a 30-year-old film. We're good. Yes. So he says, let's just wait, and then he comes back in. Oh no! As they're waiting, Somerset has a throwaway line of like, "Get a haircut." Chills. And I was like, oh. But the man.
It's also, I think, worth noting that the Mills refers to this guy from the FBI as Stinky Man.
Oh my
God. He's played by Mark Boone Jr.
Yes.
Who is also kind of a larger gentleman.
He's a larger guy.
So he's another guy referred to contemptuously.
100%. That's a really good point. And absolutely, Mark Boone Jr. is not as big in this film as I've known him to be in more recent stuff, but definitely is on the larger side. And again, I've spoken about this at length on this podcast, but there really is a weird line that media continue to perpetuate between uncleanliness and fatness. So you see it in Bridesmaids, you see it in Shrek. And again, this is Mills showing contempt for a body type different from his own, and just making these really abstract assessments based on that. I don't know, very odd. He's obviously got like a lot of contempt for bigger people. So we get the list back from this FBI agent, and we get a hit. There's an address on there that looks to be the one, and it's to a John Doe, and they're like, what are the chances, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So they go, and they're like, we're going to just have a conversation with him. It's like, oh yeah, just rock up, and he's like a serial killer. We're just going to have a conversation with him. Knocking on the door, and a man in like a raincoat and a hat comes up the stairs at the other end of the corridor. Somerset clocks it straight away and says, at Mills, look. And then that's when the guy with the hat pulls out a gun and starts shooting at them. So it means that these two now have to pull out their guns. Does Somerset also pull out his gun at this point?
He definitely pulls it out.
Pulls out. So
He doesn't fire it.
no, he doesn't fire it.
No, it's notable, and this is when what's really interesting is all the way through the film there has been this sort of sense of danger, sense of threat, but there's never actually been a moment up until now when Mills and Somerset have been in genuine danger.
Yes.
Now we get it all at once, and it is what's interesting is the film's style shifts significantly, because earlier on it's been a lot of steady cam. There have been traveling shots that slowly follow characters into rooms, but here the camera goes a lot more. It's a lot more handheld. The cuts are much faster. This is if you like David Fincher demonstrating, yes, actually I am a versatile filmmaker, and he's a wonderful demonstration of the cinematic craft of really thrusting you, the viewer, into that situation, and being able to follow Mills as he is chasing after Doe. And it's interesting that we only ever see Doe in sort of silhouette, in shadow, obscured by rain, of course. Right up until the point where they run through the various parts of the city, and eventually Mills is heading along, and then he gets clobbered in the head with a tire iron. And it's fascinating because at this point Doe could very easily have killed him. And again we get this shot of the gun pointed against Mills's temple, and we have this extreme close-up of the gun with John Doe completely out of focus, so we can't see him clearly, but it's very tense sequence, and
very good.
I don't know if I was expecting Mills to be killed at that point the first time I saw it, but if he had been, it would have been consistent. But of course, no Doe lets him live, and off he goes.
Doe shows him mercy, which he brings up time and time again later, because it's not Mills's time. Mills's place in his plan is much bigger than right now after a scuffle. But it's important to note this isn't the chase. Somerset and Mills knowing where he lives is not part of Doe's plan. They weren't to find his lair yet, if at all. So this really shakes John Doe, because we find out when he sees the books that he's checked out, it's like police investigation books, it's more of the deadly sin literature. So he's obviously been reading up on how police conduct investigations so he can be one step ahead of them. What he doesn't know, because it's not written anywhere because it's a secret, is that the FBI track those books that are being checked out. So he didn't know that this was possible, that he could be traced. So they really put like a spanner into John Doe's plan. And like I say, I just want to like echo what you were saying. The way that cinematography shifts into this incredibly fast paced, like you feel like you're right behind Mills the entire time. It literally is that moment when he like sprints towards the staircase as soon as it kicks off, it goes into shaky cam, and it's like you're just running behind him. It's really, really well done. And again, like we had that running through different people's flats or houses. People, again, we mentioned earlier, it seemed not shocked, but also a bit like nonplussed either. It was a very odd atmosphere when he's running through these places. Again, that these houses don't have much personality to them. They're quite drab, which makes sense for our setting. So again, this is a place with no life. There's no soul, unfortunately. But it leads to, like say, this mercy, and Mills has, I'm assuming, broken his arm. And so he needs to, get that put into a sling. And they go back to the flat, and Somerset's like, well, we can't go in because we haven't got a warrant. And Mill's like, well, we've got just cause. He's just shot at us. He's like, it doesn't work like that. Like if we break the law here, they could throw the case out. He could walk away free from everything. And Mills just won't listen. And in his anger, in his wrath, kicks down the door and instantly regrets it. And you're like, oh, well, it's done now. We can't get annoyed at it. But he then goes and finds a homeless person to pay off to give them kind of like a justification of why they burst through the door to protect the case. So I thought that was really interesting.
Notable. Yeah, it's notable, therefore, that this is the second time we've got an instance of the police being corrupt. Somerset mentions that the police, probably himself, take money from journalists.
Yes, that's true.
They get access to crime scenes, and then Mills does his own bit of, and Somerset takes place in this sort of the illegal gathering of data relating to library checkouts, and then Mills says, "I know, let's get a bit of falsify some evidence here." So there is no innocence here.
I was going to say, but I can imagine Mills and Somerset both justify that corruption because it's for like the greater good. It's for it's to further the case. But again, that's so subjective, right? Like, I mean, it's easy to absolve yourself when you've gone, but yeah, it's for the greater good. I'm saving lives. It's like there's 3 people who are dead at the moment. So how many lives are you saving?
Well, in theory, 4.
Well. Yeah, but we'll get into that. So they get access to John Doe's apartment, and what a set. Like, it just looks so sinister, and it's black, it's dark, there's no natural light. Above the bed is this neon crucifix. There are just shelves and shelves and shelves of these books that famously were completely written out, front and back pages. Like we've got trophies, I guess you could say, from each of the crime scenes. So you find Victor's hand. There's images from the other 2 crime scenes. I can't remember if there's actual trophies or if it's just pictures. I think it might be just pictures he's taken. And then Mills...
surprised he didn't take the pound of flesh.
Yeah, well, I guess it's like a message though, isn't it?
I guess leave it on the scales.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Mills finds like his dark room, so he's looking at all these pictures he's taken, and that's when he sees the picture from him on the stairs yelling at that photographer. Yep. It's a fantastic picture as well. I think it's so cool and iconic looking. I just think, it's really well done. And that's when they realize, we had him. It's interesting. Mills says that we had him. I was like, but you didn't, because you had no idea who you had. Like you didn't know who you had in that moment. And then the phone rings, and they run around looking for it. Mills shouts at everyone to be quiet so he can hear out for it. It's under all these clothes, and it is John Doe ringing to tell them how much he admires them for, I guess, being one step ahead, for outsmarting him, because obviously he's the smartest person in the room, right? And he hangs up. Somerset's able to record it very quickly, very quick thinking from Somerset's point of view. But they keep dusting for prints, and that's when one of the CSI, a woman, comes in and says
with a line.
Yeah, with a line. She goes, "You won't believe this, but we can't find a fingerprint anywhere." And Mills says, "Yeah, you're right. I don't believe you. Keep looking."
Indeed.
So they do find a receipt for a Wild Bill's leather store, and I wondered if this was a reference to Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs.
I think it probably is.
Yeah,
it's I mean, when it comes to in the subgenre of the serial killer thriller, the serial killer film, the Silence of the Lambs and Se7en tend to be held up as here are the perfect examples of this subgenre.
Definitely.
And there are, I think, some parallels between John Doe and Hannibal Lecter. They're both highly intelligent and have a very particular view of the world. I think the main difference is Dr. Lecter is all about he's just he's more honest. I think he's indulging himself, whereas Doe appears to have sort of more delusions of grandeur, that he is doing something important. But yes, I think the having this leather goods store and fetish gear store called Wild Bill is a reference to Buffalo Bill and the Silence of the Lambs. Now, this is one of those where we get into another incredibly disturbing part of the film where it is all in your mind. Because so Mills and Somerset, they go to the store, they meet the proprietor who shows a photograph, a Polaroid. We don't see what's on that picture. Come to think of it, much like in The Silence of the Lambs, when Clarice Starling is shown a Polaroid of what Dr. Lecter did to a nurse.
Yes. Oh, that's a very good parallel. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't see what's in the picture, but we know it's something that's making, in this case, Mills and Somerset go, oh my. And they take the picture off, and there's another of those sort of witty moments.
Yes.
As they take the picture, and Wild Bill yells after them, "Hey, the picture!"
Yeah.
Fucking, he's strangely British.
Yeah, I know.
He's like, fucking pigs.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, and from there we go directly to our next victim. Yes, I think that's right. Next victim straight away. Yeah, which is in a brothel.
A brothel. Yeah,
a brothel. But here's the interesting thing, right? The police arrive at this brothel. We see again the proprietor, essentially, insisting to the officers, like, no, I haven't seen anything. I've been here the whole time. And we go into a room, one of the rooms, and there is a man there looking fairly hysterical, and he has this blanket across his body, and something is sticking up out of it in the position where his cock would be. But he's certainly not looking happy. And there is a woman on the bed, and you just have actually, you can see a bed and you can see some feet. And I think you see the word lust on the wall.
Yeah.
But fascinatingly, there is a shot of the bed, and you can see some arms and legs, but you do not see the body. Mills's body completely blocks. Whatever is there, we don't know. It's clearly horrible. It's another crime scene. We assume it's a dead body, but we don't get to see it. And it's interesting. We'd say, well, not unlike, I guess, the Gluttony crime scene. We're being given bits and pieces, but we don't have the full story. We know there's something made by Wild Bill. We know this is in a brothel, so we can probably assume that there's that the victim is a prostitute, and we know that there's some thing under a blanket and something being blocked. And it's not until we get to the police interview rooms where we actually finally see the Polaroid. Now, quick point on this. Friend of mine who absolutely loves Se7en, he calls it like his favorite film ever. For a long time, he'd only seen a TV edit. And in the TV edit, that you never actually see the Polaroid.
Oh my God. Okay. So what did he think then? What was his interpretation?
Because the dialogue refers to this thing, because what we see in the Polaroid is that this is essentially it is a strap-on dildo with a knife blade.
Yeah.
So as soon as you see that and you realize, wait, so that sort of goes on the guy, and oh no. And your mind just does not want to go there.
No.
Of course, it goes there anywhere. And you have the guy saying, so he came in, he put that thing on me, and he put the gun in my, he put the gun in my mouth. Fuck, the fucking gun was in my throat. He made me fuck her. Oh God. So it is, I mean, the man is understandably hysterical.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, right, so it was this, so he strapped a knife on the guy and then made him fuck this sex worker to death.
Yeah.
That is so fucked up.
Oh, it's awful. It truly is. You don't, I appreciate, like, don't show us the aftermath. I really, 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 really do. I do query whether if they did, whether they would have even got a rating because it just seems so obscene. Um, but I think you don't need to see it because just the idea alone literally just makes you want to gag. It's one of the worst deaths I think in film, like truly.
Yeah.
And I think the guy who plays the John, he's amazing. Like I fully believe everything he's saying. His hysteria is so palpable. Um, but what I wanted to ask is this is the first time John Doe has brought in an accomplice into one of these murders. And I want to know who is the real victim of lust?
Good point. Well, in one respect, you could say, well, it is the dead person. It is
Yeah.
the sex worker. She is the
Mm-hmm.
one who has been very, brutally murdered.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you could almost say that the John, the guy who had the strap on,
Mm-hmm.
is almost like a bonus victim.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for from Doe's perspective. However, I think it's also, again, it's the uncomfortable, probably unintentional, but nonetheless problematic misogyny at work here, that the sex worker is not given any identity. As I said
Nope.
before, we don't learn her name.
Mm-mm.
And the emphasis is upon the hysterical man. His
Yes.
life is probably completely ruined. He'll be in therapy the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Um, and our emphasis is upon him. And I think you probably heard of the phrase by the great film critic Roger Ebert, who
Mm-hmm.
described cinema as an empathy machine.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question in this sequence is, who are we? We are being invited to empathize with the John, not the sex worker.
Yes.
He's the one that we are invited to feel very sympathetic towards. And as you say, and it works. His panic, his terror. Now, on the one hand, that is kind of problematic because it's kind of saying this man's hysteria is what we're invited to look at rather than the violent death of a woman. Having said that, it perhaps is that necessary almost mediation because the death of the sex worker is so incredibly horrific
Mm-hmm.
that perhaps it would be really difficult to get past that,
Mm-hmm.
to get past the sheer brutality, the sheer gruesomeness. And perhaps if maybe we just if we'd only seen the John there and then we hadn't seen him again and it'd just been another discussion in the precinct between them, maybe one of them relaying what happened. Some are saying, well, according to the John Doe strapped the guy down and
Yes.
then tied the girl down, strapped the thing on him, and then he made him do it.
Mm-hmm.
Then our attention would have been upon the sex workers as a
Yes.
victim, but
Yes.
perhaps but maybe the way our minds work, it would have been so extreme, we wouldn't have been able to get past that extremity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like the hysterical John is us. He's putting us into that. The idea of us being thought about, because, and I suppose this is part of one of the points of the film, because the film is very much about sin, about the pervasive, all-consuming power of sin. I'll refer again to Richard Dyer's book about the film, where he actually discusses it in relation to sin throughout. And I think maybe that's it's kind of inviting almost a culpability in terms of who is the sinner here. I mean, the John, he's the guy who's actually following his lust.
Yes.
The sex worker was the one profiting from it. Now, one could argue, well, they're both, guilty of lust, one exploiting it, the other indulging it. So in that respect, you could say they are both equally victims. But I wonder if there is actually a way of, this is the way the film is kind of working to implicate the viewer, because most of this is also extreme, and the death of the sex worker is so extreme that we can feel a certain distance from it all. But to focus on somebody who's left behind, who's saying, oh God, please help me, maybe that's kind of maybe it's getting us to engage with that, and the fact that we probably think about that death. Oh God, this is so terrible. This is so horrendous. Help me. That it's almost putting us in there. I often think about films at their best work not just to express something, but to envelop you, to bring you into it. And I think Seven is incredibly atmospheric. And part of that atmosphere is to bring the viewer in. And perhaps this is a particularly pronounced instance of that. People may be listening and saying, like, yeah, you're pushing this. I'm not buying it. But that's probably because I'm just coming up with this as I'm talking.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
But it is a it's a difficult scene to unpick.
Yes. I just to add to that, I've always interpreted it that the sex worker is collateral damage and the true victim is the John. And the reason why is because in real life, sex workers' deaths are not taken seriously. They are often not given the time of day. It's almost because, oh, well, if you're a sex worker or say, your line of work means you have to work on the streets. Well, you were asking for it. Well, it's a dangerous line of work. What did you expect? And where you have the brothel owner or manager who's being interviewed by, is it Mills in the other room?
Mills.
Yeah. He's so like, everyone brings in things, guys. Like people bring in suitcases. This very like, it's not my responsibility to be like checking everyone's bags. If someone brings a knife in, someone's going to bring a knife in. If someone wants to hurt these girls, someone's going to hurt these girls. Like it's very nonchalant. And it very tellingly, Mills says, "Do you even like your job?" And the guy goes, "No, of course he doesn't. It's not a nice place to be, but he needs the money." And I think again, a lot of people who are in sex work do it because they need the money, and it's not a choice, or they could be exploited. Sex trafficking is very much a thing, and you query like, is it a cinematic choice? Is it a narrative choice to make this victim in this point a sex worker who is, there's a real push to move away from the term prostitute to sex worker, because throughout the years, the term prostitute brings very little empathy. In fact, it probably brings judgment. So if we move to sex worker, give them more agency, give them this idea that they are like, in work. It's not a personality trait. It's a job. And again, think about how many Jane Doe sex workers there have been in various true crime stories. And when I watch this scene, I just can't help but relate it to real life. And again, I'd have to ask David Fincher or sorry, what's the writer called? Andrew
Kevin Walker.
Kevin Walker. Thank you, Andrew Kevin Walker. What his intention was for that scene, because that's how I've always read it. So yeah, I think it is an interesting one to unpack.
I will
years later.
I will give a recommendation for a movie that takes a very interesting look at sex workers and is indeed based on sex worker experiences. It's a film called At Zola.
At Zola?
Yep.
Zola?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
But with the at symbol at the start.
Okay.
Because it was a film based on a Twitter thread. So, here at where I work at Lancaster University, where we have a Centre for Gender Studies, and we hold feminist movie nights. And earlier this year, one of the film we showed was At Zola, which is very interesting portrayal of the sex worker experience based on the actual experiences of a sex worker.
That sounds really interesting.
For an alternative view, I recommend it.
100%. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. So that is Lust.
I keep mixing these up, actually. Whenever I always have to go back to film and check. Oh no, I keep thinking Pride comes before Lust, but no, Lust then Pride.
Yes, we have this scene with Mills and Somerset in the bar, and that's when we have that apathy conversation, and we really get an understanding of why Mills is doing what he's doing, because he has to believe in something. He's got to be believing he's doing it for the greater good, and he won't just blindly agree with Somerset to make himself feel better that he's leaving when he actually doesn't truly want to be leaving.
Yeah. In the very first scene before the credits, when they first meet, Somerset does say, Mills, I thought we might find a bar somewhere. And finally, they do.
They do. That's a really good point. Yeah, full circle moment.
Indeed. And it is, again, it's a demonstration of their bonding. Here they are properly
Yes.
like hanging out as this goes. What's interesting is I think the antagonism that there's been between them has largely gone.
I
They are
agree.
now a lot more, I don't know if they're friends, but
Mm.
they are now partners, and
Yes.
they're on each other's, they get each other's wavelength. Even though they disagree,
Mm-hmm.
Mills is still able to say, as he leaves, he says, thank you, though.
Mm-hmm.
And he
Yeah,
appreciates what Somerset is trying to do, even
100%.
if he doesn't agree with him. It's a buddy cop moment. It's also it's a mentor moment. We're back on The
Mm.
Empire Strikes Back again. It's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. You could almost have had Somerset saying, "Listen hard, must you?" And Mills is like, "No, I need to go save my friends." There is a sort of weird parallel there.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
definitely. And
but notably, we do see a further sort of cracking because Mills goes home and hugs his
mm-hmm.
wife.
Says I love you.
Somerset
Mm-hmm.
goes home. Somerset can't sleep. We've
Mm-hmm.
seen him putting himself to sleep with the metronome,
Mm-hmm.
and he smashes the metronome and instead
Mm-hmm.
tries throwing his switchblade at his
Yes.
dartboard. It's a good
Yes.
shot, actually.
It was. I thought that.
Yeah, so it's clear demonstration that all of this is getting to Somerset.
Yes. Definitely. Definitely. I think like again the metronome is to help him like focus on that rather than the noise outside of this like sirens, the screaming, the chaos, which is this city. And then all of a sudden he's like, no, he actually kind of needs to be immersed in it in this moment because he's still here. He's still living in this city. He's still trying to save this city in this moment. Um, we get to Sunday, a day of rest. Uh, and so we find that we've got our victim of pride. You mentioned earlier that we do know that this is someone that John Doe might have known.
I
Who?
got the impression that the pride victim was a model.
Okay, because again, like we don't get a name, unfortunately, for this person. We see a face, but it's on a big portrait that's kind of been fallen down off the bed, and she's covered in bandages, and in one hand she's had a bottle of sleeping pills glued to her hand, on the other is a phone, and basically it's either you could call for help, or you could kill yourself via these sleeping pills because John Doe has cut off her nose
To
to
spite her face.
yay comedy duo. Yeah, and so she has decided to take the pills, and is again I find that very interesting. I can't remember if there's any like dismissiveness on this because I can imagine there might have been because of like the vanity of it all. But we don't know her name, and I guess her only reason for being a victim is that she is a model and I guess has gained fame, fortune because of her looks, and that's enough to be on John Doe's list at this point.
Well, I think it may not even be that. It seems it could be more basic, a matter of here is somebody who has taken pride in her appearance. She has made herself into a figure of beauty. That is
Yeah.
taking pride. How
Yeah.
dare she?
How dare she? Yeah. Like, oh, okay. I don't know. It just seems like, I mean, I know a lot of these are like, some of them are so like obvious in their motives, and some of them are so you're clutching at straws here, John. Like, is there no one else more, deserving of this gruesome murder? No, apparently not. It has to be this poor woman. And again, we do not see his work here. It is all to the imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's always the aftermath. It's the crime scenes of what we see.
Yes, yeah. I think that's a very where I guess like famously Saw fills in the gaps. Because even when they go to the crime scenes for Jigsaw, they have those kind of like music video shot edits of what happened before they became the corpse. So
Hmm.
yeah, they really do fill in the gaps. So that's Pride. And then we get to the precinct, Somerset and Mills are, chatting shit, walking through, and John Doe, or the back of John Doe, has walked into the precinct. And we can see that he's covered in blood. There's blood spatters on him, and he's got bandages on his fingertips. And we hear detectives, detectives, detectives. So loud. And
You're
finally,
looking for me.
yes. And it is, I mean, I guess it wasn't advertised at the time, but it is Kevin Spacey in this role. And it's the first time we get to see him as the audience. And Mills straight away pulls out his gun. Somerset looks startled, right? He's like, again, I can imagine his cogs are turning. Why would he come in? Why would he hand himself in at this moment? What's going on? What's the next step of this plan? Because he can't be just turning himself in. Something else must be happening here. And so they arrest him and they put him into an interview room where he gets to meet with he asks for his lawyer. Is it Robert Schiff? Is that his name? The lawyer. He's from Jurassic Park: The Lost World.
Oh, that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, that guy. And and we could see that we can't hear the conversation, but we can see, and every so often John Doe looks towards the one-way, two-way mirror, and he's obviously saying things, and I guess explaining. He's confessing, right? He is confessing. He is turned himself in. And the captain, I think he kind of dismisses it, going, "Hey, you got your guy, great work." And Mills says, "No, this can't be it. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right." And Somerset says, "For the first time ever, I completely agree with you."
Indeed, yeah. It's the Mills describes it as this guy is pissing in our faces, and we're taking it like idiots, and so on. That there is so much more going on here. Oddly, I thought this line was in the film, but it may only be in the trailer.
Okay.
That Somerset says he's 2 murders away from completing his masterpiece.
No, I think he does say that in the film. I think I heard that earlier.
Okay, fair enough. Well,
Yes.
point being, it makes, but that is the point at which. And what's fascinating is we, the viewers, are in the same position, because all the way through, we've been following these detectives saying, okay, how are they going to catch the guy? How are they going to catch the guy? And it's like, wait, hang on. The guy has just walked in. Now, I remember reading an anecdote about this. When David Fincher was reading the script, he got to that point and was like, wait a minute, there's a big part of the script left, a good 30-odd pages left. In screenwriting parlance, I think 1 minute is roughly 1 page is roughly equal to a minute of screen time.
Yes.
So he was like, the killer's just given himself up. How is this the ending? What more is there to come? And we are, of course, thinking the same thing. And of course, John Doe's meticulous planning continues.
Yes. So his meticulous planning has led him to the precinct where he has agreed, or he has proposed, a few deals. So he has said there are 2 bodies left. So we've got 2 sins left, right? We've got wrath and we've got envy. So we've got 2 more victims to come. He says, okay, so either he wants to show Mills and Somerset where those bodies are at 6 p.m. this evening, and after we've done that, he will go, he'll plead guilty and go willingly to jail, or he will fight and plead not guilty. Oh no, he'll plead insanity, and the lawyer says, and I'll get him off with that.
Yeah.
So in this, we've got the captain, we've got Somerset and Mills, and we also have the DA that we've briefly seen earlier in the film,
played by Richard Roundtree, who became famous for playing Shaft.
Oh my, I had no idea. There you go. Yeah, so it's interesting because I think, is it the DA or the captain says, well, I've got half a mind to let those 2 bodies rot.
It's the DA who says
it's
that.
It's the DA. And it's just like, where's your empathy? When these poor victims, these families, obviously because they don't know what's coming, like these families have got people that they would want to bury. And again, the lawyer mentions that, like, well, the media would have a field day if they heard you say that, that you don't care enough to find these 2 last victims. And the captain then says to Somerset and Mills, because again, they're very curious, right? Curiosity killed the cat. They're like, we've got to end this, And the captain says, it's your call, it's your case. Do detectives get a say in whether they accept the plea deals or not?
Well, I think it's, not worth worrying about, is this what would happen in reality? No. This is a fiction. It is an art. It is a film. It is an artifice. What will happen because what works dramatically. Do the detectives get to decide this? No. But Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman get to decide it because they're the stars. Because they are the protagonists. Yes. They will determine this. So I think in that respect, it makes dramatic sense that they
Yeah.
do that.
No, you're totally
The
right.
whole
And
thing, and again, but it's interesting. You mentioned the phrase "curiosity killed the cat." I would suggest it's also suggesting a sense of fatal curiosity as a sin. It's almost like
oh.
their willingness to see how this plays out, and of course, ours as the
Mm-hmm.
viewers, we
Mm-hmm.
want to see how this plays out. Imagine how unsatisfied we'd all be if they'd said, "No, fine, lock him up, whatever,"
That's
and
it. You're
leave it at that.
so right. Like as an audience member, you're also like hungry for like resolution. You're hungry for revenge, vengeance, whatever. You're hungry like to like, close the story off. There are two more bodies. We need to know. And again, like the film is set up that every death has been this spectacular, gruesome affair. Even though we haven't seen it, we know it. And so it's like, well, the climax is going to be a big one, right? We can't not see that. So yeah, you're totally right. As an audience member, we are also guilty of, being too curious, being too um bloodthirsty,
Yeah.
right? Uh,
It's worth noting that, of course, I mean, this film does close itself off. It has even though the ending is devastating, it is still neat. It is tied off. And it's notable that
Definitely.
12 years later,
Hmm.
David Fincher would make another serial killer film, which famous in the form of Zodiac,
Yes.
which has no resolution.
No.
And
No.
it's interesting that it was something that he could return to, but in a very different way. And
Yeah.
I think Zodiac works in a different way
Oh
to
yeah, I really
Seven.
like Zodiac. Really like
Yeah,
Zodiac.
it might. Yeah, it's another stunning film, but interestingly, does not have that resolution that we want. I remember I was
Mhm.
watching Zodiac one time with somebody who didn't know anything about it and said,
Oh, okay.
"So when do they catch him?" And I'm like, "They don't.
They
Never. No.
don't.
Zodiac killer
Yeah.
never found."
Yeah.
Oh, and it would be, in the case of Zodiac, because that's based on real events, it's able to turn that lack of knowledge into a satisfying conclusion. In the
Hmm.
case of Seven, the structure is so this is there's a clue in the title. We want our last two victims, and indeed we have the same fatal sin of
Yes.
curiosity as Mills and Somerset.
Definitely. Definitely. So we agree that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna drive out into the middle of absolutely nowhere, out of the city, most importantly.
Bear in mind
To
now it's sunny.
I was gonna say the weather has completely changed. We have clear skies, it's sunny, it's dry. And so we're going into the middle of nowhere. It's Somerset and Mills, and then John Doe in one car, and then you've got the SWAT and the helicopters tracking them. They've got microphones on, and they have a really nice little, again, like buddy cop moment where they're shaving their chest hair for the
Mm-hmm.
for the microphones to stick on, and it's like, what would if I get workers' comp if I shaved off my nipple? It's
Well,
really
if you put in a claim, I'd buy you one.
yeah, no, he says something like, if you're brave enough to like put in a claim, I'd pay you out of my own pocket. Yeah, it's a really lovely scene. Again, it's another laughing scene. And they get in the car, and again, it's very interesting, but Mills is still so dismissive of John Doe. Bearing
Yep.
in mind they have been run around this city, they have currently five dead bodies. This man clearly has not done yet. There's still two more bodies unaccounted for. And Mills is just like so dismissive, so like condescending, patronizing towards John Doe. And then that's when we get the like, you've killed innocent people. And John Doe takes such offense to this. He's like, innocent? And you probably know the quote. I'm gonna let you do it.
Well, the end, this finale of it is
Mhm.
only in a world this shitty could
Yes.
you say these were innocent people and keep a straight face.
Keep a straight face. Yes, because he
And
seems
this is
laughable.
yeah, and this is after he's described the five victims so far.
Yeah. So
Saying that a man so obese that
I
he
was
would make you sick. The lawyer keeping
exactly.
off the streets, a drug dealing pederast.
Yes.
Notably, I think I must disagree with your point earlier. I think
Mm.
that the sex worker is the victim because he says the
yes,
disease spreading whore.
he does. Oh God, yes, he does say the disease spreading whore. What an awful thing to say. I mean, I know John Doe's awful, but oh my God, he's awful in that moment.
Yes, he's
But
not
yeah,
very
you're
creative
right.
in that. I mean, and it's disappointing. Like, come on, John, you're more creative than that. And
Yes,
then and he says, he demonstrates a woman so ugly on the inside
inside.
she couldn't bear to go on living if she wasn't beautiful on the outside.
I think it's really
Yeah.
telling as well that, like, he starts off this explanation with maybe around 4 or 5 lines describing his repulsion towards gluttony, but then they end up just being one lines for the rest. So, like, for example, the two female victims literally get one line of an explanation. And I don't know whether that's on purposefully misogynistic or whether that is just because, like, narratively it makes sense. You kind of, like, go big and then go smaller and more concise as you rant continues. But I thought it was very telling that, again, coming back to the fact that the three victims that we don't know their names of are the fat person who is ridiculed and mocked by almost everybody within the film, and then our two female characters, one being a sex worker, completely dismissed, and then the other, I mean, yeah, we are assuming she's a model, but she gets very little screen time because at this point in the film, we're like ramping up to the final, ramping up to the climax. So it's like they're like victims of the film's runtime as well. Where, like, Pride, oh, we got to just get Pride out the way, and then we've got to move on to the next one.
Yeah. Yes. And bear in mind, Seven is it's not a particularly short film. It's just over
No,
2 hours. So
but
and notably though, the pacing of it works throughout. It takes its time
yes,
early
yes,
on,
I think the
and then
pacing's
things get faster.
fantastic. Yeah, exactly that. The pacing really, really does hit so well for me personally. And I guess, like, pacing is quite a subjective thing, but for me, it really, really does work. So we get to the location that John Doe wants us to get to, and they let him out, and they're like exploring, and there's a dead dog, and he goes, "Well, I didn't do that." I was like, that's a
Yeah.
great line. Love that. There's a
And what
train.
time is it?
Yes, it's 7:01. It's
Mm-hmm.
7:01. There is a trailer here, and it looks to have like a banner on it. Could you make out what the banner said?
Oh, I was looking for that. No,
Yeah,
I
no,
couldn't quite make it out.
I couldn't see it either. And I don't know whether it's anything more to do with, I don't know, sins of some kind. And there's it looks to be a van is barreling down towards this access road, and so Somerset's like, "Oh, I'm going to go meet them because it might be, there's a fear it's an ambush." Like, they genuinely don't know what they've walked into. So Somerset goes off, and that's when John Doe says to Mills, "Oh, I'm so glad we've got some time to talk to each other." And in that, we find that he says, "I'm not lying when I said I admired you. You've been able to curate such an ordinary or normal life for yourself." And then he says about meeting Tracy. "I went round to your house or your apartment this morning and met your wife, Tracy." And it's interesting because Mills, again, is being very dismissive in this moment, going like, "Oh, shut up, because he's focusing on what Somerset's doing up with the van. And it's only when he mentions Tracy does he turn around and actually start listening to what he's saying, because all of a sudden it's very sinister.
What'd you
Uh,
fucking say?
yeah. And that's, as an audience, we're like, "Oh no, like, what's happened? What's going on?"
Mm-hmm.
And then Somerset's made it to the van. It's a delivery driver, and he said, like, "Oh, I was paid $500 to drop at this location at this time at 7." So he gets the box. He tells the van driver to leave on foot. And he opens it. And again, as an audience, we don't see. We hear there's blood, and then he steps back and gasps while we're hearing John Doe speak to Mills about his wife and how he tried to play house with his wife. And then when she didn't take too kindly to it, he got annoyed or angry.
He just says, "So I took a souvenir."
"Oh, I took a souvenir." That's
Her
it.
pretty head.
Her pretty head. And at that point, that's when Somerset realized, he says to California, well, regardless of what you hear, keep out of here. John Doe has the upper hand. He's running towards Mills, and John Doe going like, "Throw your gun away, throw your gun away."
And
And
we
this
get
is,
another instance of shaky cam at that point, the camera following behind Somerset as he's running towards them, which
good
I think is a
point.
way of indicating okay, everything is completely going to shit now.
Yeah, it was absolute panic.
Yeah.
And again, we have this, what's in the box? What's in the box? Very, very glorious. And he says, I was envious. I'm envious of your life. And so he's saying, like, so this is the bit I really wanted to challenge here. So throughout the film, up until this point, and I would have put lust into this, but John does make it clear that his lust victim is the sex worker. The victims of the deadly sins have been people who've perpetuated the sin themselves. And this is when it shifts to actually they're the victims of someone who is committing the sin. So Tracy is the victim of John Doe because John Doe is the envious one.
Okay, interesting. Tracy, bizarrely isn't a victim of sin. She is, and she is a truly innocent victim.
Right.
So yeah, if we want to challenge John Doe, that's what we challenge him on. It's like, hang on, you did kill an innocent person.
Yeah.
Motherfucker.
Yeah.
You, or should I say mother deheader, beheader. Yeah, because the victims of the sins are our, obese man, our lawyer, our, drug dealer, sex worker, model, and then Doe himself and Mills.
But Mills,
Tracy is almost collateral damage.
Yes. Well, so this is my point. So if I follow my thought through, so if not that I say Tracy is the victim of, no, she is, the thing is, that's the thing, she is the victim of envy, but she herself is not the perpetrator of the envy. And then Mills is the one who enacts the sin of wrath to murder John Doe.
Right.
So we end up with 7 bodies.
Yes.
But are we saying there's 8 victims?
Well, you could say there are 10 victims, actually, because you could also include the John.
The John, yeah.
And you could also include Tracy's unborn baby.
Tracy's unborn. And that's the thing, because he says like, oh, and her baby. And he goes, oh, she hadn't told you yet.
Yes.
And he takes such pleasure in knowing he's the one who breaks to her. And the score at that moment is a bah, bah, bah. It was like, oh my God, like it really is a earth-shattering moment. And again, like Brad Pitt is so good in this moment. There's that, like, he's obviously pointing the gun at John Doe, and he keeps on, like, like you can see it. He's like, I'm gonna do it, and then he like kind of gives up and he looks away, like as he's trying to like hyperventilate or like trying to catch his breath, and he does it again. And I don't know, there's something really human, actually. I feel really human in that moment. And then ultimately he lets his wrath out, and it's not just one shot, it's the entire thing, isn't it? It's like bang bang bang, magazine. Thank you.
He empties his gun into
him. Yeah,
unnecessarily. The first bullet was through his head.
Oh no, yeah, he was down, wasn't he? But it is pure wrath, fury. It's revenge. He really does completely give himself over to that sin, and Somerset just watches. There's nothing he could do. There's nothing he could say. He tried to say, it's done, and then we cut to nighttime. And he's being put into it. This is Mills. He's being put into a police car, and the captain says, "We'll take good care of him." And Somerset says, "Anything he needs." And he goes, "Oh, where are you going to go now?" And he says, "I'll be around." Is it where? Is it around? And Somerset kind of walks off into the distance, and then it cuts to black.
Well, we get the final voiceover moment.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I forgot about the voiceover moment. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we love a Morgan Freeman voiceover.
Yeah. Yes.
And he has the final line. Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a good place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
Yes.
Which is a wonderful summation of the film as a whole. The world is not good. The world is very clearly very bad. But this is why, when I did my master's dissertation, I did say there was this spark of redemption there. in that, there is some, because Somerset was ready to give up.
Yes,
But come this finale, it suggests, well, no, he isn't. It's still worth fighting for. And it's interesting to think about, because Mills, okay, he's obviously not dead, but I mean, his life is ruined. I'm sure his career's over.
I know.
Like the John from early, he's going to be in therapy the rest of his life. Maybe the two of them can be in a. It's like at the end of The Dark Knight. He'll be in a padded cell forever. Maybe we can share one. Yeah. So certainly, the murder of Tracy is outside of the purview of the Seven Sins, but Mills, certainly we have another life ruined in the form of Mills. Do you know about the alternative endings?
No, I do not. Please enlighten.
Sure thing. Right. When David Fincher was originally sent the script for Seven, he read it through. It was the script that we eventually saw on screen. And he was like, wow, that's amazing. Turned out he'd been sent the wrong script.
I had heard that because he's been, not well liked after Alien 3, and I really like Alien 3.
Me too.
Yeah.
But so he'd been sent the wrong version of the script. That was Andrew K. Walker's original version. But the studio had seen that and were like, that is too dark an ending. Give us something a bit more optimistic. And there were a couple of different versions, one of which was Mills and Somerset getting notification from Tracy and rushing to save her. But the ending that was actually storyboard, and again, this is one of the extras on the DVD, is you've got Mills and Somerset. So, it happens as it happens, up to the point of like, is Mills going to shoot Doe or not? And then Somerset shot Doe. Somerset shot Doe. And I think the line was, Mills asks, "What are you doing?" And Somerset's like, "I'm retiring."
Yeah.
So in that respect, a more optimistic ending.
And he takes the bullet in that sense. So
and therefore John Doe's masterpiece is not completed. So that's what the studio, Art Linson was the producer, I think. That's what they wanted to go with. Brad Pitt wanted the darker ending, and he was the only one with the right sort of with enough clout because he's the biggest star of it.
Sure.
And he said, "No, we stick with the darker ending," which was what Fincher wanted. I don't know what Morgan Freeman wanted, but because Pitt supported Fincher to go with the original ending, that's why we get the ending that we got. And bravo.
Yeah,
bravo.
I agree.
Would we still be talking about Seven with quite the same awe and reverence nearly 30 years later if it hadn't had such a gut punch of a finale?
Exactly that. I think it wouldn't have this. It definitely wouldn't have the same legacy, because part of the whole film is this idea that it ends in such a sad place, losing Tracy, losing Mills. These people who definitely Tracy more than Mills, where Tracy is the light, and then Mills is trying to do the right thing. He wants to make the world a better place. He's still got that spirit. It's not been knocked out of him the same way it's been knocked out of Somerset. And it is hopelessness. It is absolute hopelessness. And yes, okay, we do have the light of Somerset being he's going to stick around. He's not gonna run away just yet. But he's also getting on. He does deserve retirement at some point.
Yeah.
It is. I'm glad from a cinematic point of view it is what it is, because it really does hit in a way that I think very few films are brave enough to do, and especially films of this level of Hollywood status.
Mainstream,
exactly that, mainstream. David, especially David Fincher coming back from quote unquote a dud. I disagree, but box officely, a dud. Being brave enough to be no, and I'm gonna go against the studio again and do something, darker, more twisted in an already dark and twisty film. I think completely echo your bravo. I think I'm really glad they stuck to their guns on it. So we've come to the end of Seven. We have our victims. We have Mills in a car going to some kind of prison, I'm assuming. God bless him. And after all of that, and after everything we've talked about, and I know we've talked at length. I mean, this is going to be a long episode. Is there anything else that we have missed that you want to like add some focus to?
Yeah. Seven, like The Silence of the Lambs, falls
Mm,
into a debate over whether it is a horror film or whether it's a
yes.
thriller.
Very good question. Yeah.
Now, I am interested. How do you regard it?
Hmm. I think it's both. And I know it's such a cop out to say, but like the two are so aligned anyway. Like thriller and horror really do like, rub each other's shoulders in the genre pile. I My nervousness is that when a film wants to market itself as more mainstream, they'll call it a thriller because that's just seen as more appealing. People really recoil at the word horror because especially nowadays, even now, even though we're 20 years removed, people think of like the torture porn years. And I'm just like, it's more than that. I always say other genres wish they had the same scope of field that horror does. Because horror can really tackle anything and any issue or any story through the lens of horror. But with this, obviously the acts, the murders, the tension is very horror like, but I think because we don't actually see anything, I'm not saying you should see something for it to be horror, but it is a very conscious decision that we don't see anything. I think that's why it retains that thriller aspect, and it is the same with The Silence of the Lambs. There isn't that. I guess the biggest gruesome part of that film will be when Hannibal Lecter. Oh, spoilers for Silence of the Lambs, another 30-year-old film. But the most gruesome part is when Hannibal Lecter breaks out of his cell
Mm-hmm.
and he goes after those two cops. That's probably more gruesome, like physically violent, than we see anything in Seven.
Okay, yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and yet, like I think it's both. I think it's both. Can it be both? Can I cop out and say both?
If you like. I won't cop out.
Okay, no, you do you.
I will say I don't think Seven is a horror film. I
Okay.
think it's horror adjacent and has many horror
Mm,
elements. But I have a definition of horror, which is that horror is about the expression of victimhood. Okay.
okay.
I mean, as you said, you don't need to see things for it to be horror,
Mm,
but we don't see anything in the Blair Witch Project, and I'm pretty sure we would all consider that a horror film.
100% one of my faves.
Now, in the case of The Silence of the Lambs, the status of the victim is actually on screen, both in the case of Catherine Martin,
Yeah.
and I think Clarice Starling is also consistently victimized.
Yeah.
In the case of Seven, while both films have the detective procedural element, Seven does not have the emphasis of the expression of victimization.
Mm,
Everything we see of the victims is the aftermath. Every crime, every horrific act is a crime scene for detectives to deal with. So I work on that basis that Seven works as a thriller because its emphasis is upon the detection purely, and the victimization is not there. With one really interesting exception, which I realized on this recent viewing. Who is the one victim we see die?
John Doe.
And talking about when Mills is emptying his gun into Doe, we get a point of view shot. We are
We
placed.
do.
Yeah. So the whole idea of being implicated within the sin of the film, it is there at the very end. It's similar to the death of the villain in Avatar. Very different film, but
Very.
similarly, we get a point of view shot of the villain as an arrow is rushing towards him. And in the case of Seven, we get, I think actually it's after Doe's already dead, but we're still getting a point of view from his perspective. So there's a horror inflections throughout the film. There's plenty of horrific moments, but the only true moment of victimhood is that of the almost self-inflicted victim of envy. So once again, it is very much a film that is. So I don't think it's a horror film. I think it's a horror adjacent film.
Yeah.
That is ultimately a detective thriller, but it is most certainly a film that plays around with genre, with convention, with audience engagement.
Yes, agreed. I have another question. You've reminded me. So, John Doe's plan has obviously been in the works for at least a year, if we take into account Sloth. How does Mills and Somerset play into that plan? Did John, because obviously Mills is new, he's not a rookie to the job, but a rookie to the city. He's only there literally a day when we go into Monday. How did John Doe, like, how does that affect John Doe's plan? Because obviously Mills plays such an integral part to his masterpiece at the end.
Well, notably, of course, okay. In the initial setup, I would say Doe committed his murders, obviously include the planned ones.
Yes.
Were obviously gluttony, greed, sloth, lust, most likely pride as well. Those were probably all pre-identified victims.
Yes.
But when he phones them, when they're at his apartment, he says, I'm going to have to mix up my plans a bit. And now he's already, by that point, photographed Mills and seen, oh, that guy gets angry. He's wrathful. That's handy. He may have had a different victim for wrath planned previously, but
and envy,
and envy as well,
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, John Doe's plans, I think, are not as meticulous. Well, his planning is meticulous. His motives are not as clear cut as he would like us all to think.
Definitely.
And it's notable that although the film has a very organized structure, it also doesn't fit into that perfectly because, again, we don't get one murder a day.
No, we don't.
No victim on Wednesday, for instance. So I would say what's interesting is John Doe is not, he is meticulous, exacting, and patient. He's also adaptable. So yeah, and he does mention it's remarkable what a member of the press can bribe information, get information out of the police. He was able to get Mills's address from that. So when he was cut off from his home, from his funds, he had to improvise, and that's what he did. And his improvisation was to make Mills his victim of wrath. And then at some point he probably thought, maybe it was before, maybe it was after he visited, it's probably before he visited Tracy. He thought, oh, and envy? Wait, Detective Mills has this normal life. I envy that. Yeah, I'll do.
I'll do. I know. Yeah, it does feel very rushed, but you're right. The story is set up that it does make sense because all of a sudden he knows that they're actually on his tail a lot quicker than he expected. I guess then on that, was he always intending to die as part of this plan?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe he was. Perhaps there was another family that he envied.
He was stalking,
that he was planning to use, and then he had to put the Mills family in instead.
Yeah.
Because to set it up in that way, he had he gone to prison or even gone on trial and pled insanity, it wouldn't have been enough. It wouldn't have been complete. He needed all 7 victims.
Yeah.
And by setting it up in such a way, he probably would have always planned to make someone so angry they killed him.
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, he wants to martyr himself, right? And I can't imagine John Doe had been happy going to prison. I get he would have probably got his lawyer to plead insanity, get him off, all that kind of stuff. Because they say he's independently wealthy, so he could afford to do get the best lawyer, best defense attorney. So yeah, if that was the way it went, but it isn't the way it went, and
he won.
He won. He wins. And Somerset lives to fight another day. So yeah, it's a very good film. Is there anything else you wanted to mention?
A Only that there are so many different interesting ways of sort of understanding this film. You can understand it. We've talked about it from a genre perspective. You can talk about it as a piece of auteur cinema, as a David Fincher film. You can talk about it in terms of its star power in relation to, well, both in terms of the stars that were there and the influence Pitt had on the overall production, the omission of Kevin Spacey from any of the film's advertising.
Yes.
He doesn't appear in anything. You don't know it's him until he shows up, and his name actually is the first one that appears in the credits.
Kevin Spacey, and the credits go backwards.
In reverse.
Yeah, really interesting.
And I said at the start that it's a film with a lot of S's, and I'm referencing here Richard Dyer's book. His book about the film has, which I'm recommending, I suppose the BFI should. This has not been commissioned by the BFI, but whatever. That he has 7 chapters of sin, story, structure, seriality, sound, sight, and salvation. And all of those elements you can talk about in this film at work. And I love the way Dyer rounds off his study, that everything about Seven is so concerned with sin that it is a gripping thriller, but it is also a symphony of sin. He likens it also to King Lear, and a similarly seriously completely bleak nihilistic ending. And what I love is that here we are nearly 30 years later, and we can still talk about this film as being gripping, devastating after repeat viewings. And I think it does this, one of the smartest things that cinema can do, of truly involving the audience. It isn't just presenting and expressing, it's involving.
Absolutely. It is challenging you. I think that's something, like there's some games out there at the moment, like video games, that their whole purpose is to challenge you on how empathetic you can be. And so are you a gamer, Vincent?
I'm not. Video games for me just tend to be a cause of frustration because I'm no good at them. So it's like, this is no fun, I'm just annoyed.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. Well, The Last of Us Part 2, so Last of Us Part 1 has been made into a show. Last of Us Part 2,
which is an amazing show.
Which is, oh my God, don't get me started. I fucking love that show. I was very, very impressed. The second one is definitely a challenge. And how empathetic are you as a person? It puts you, because obviously games have to be involving. You are literally the main character. You are pushing that character forward, and it is putting you in a very difficult position of like challenging, where are you empathetic? And Part 2 got a lot of flack for a twist it does very early on to the game, and then people got pissed off about it, and I'm like, you have failed the challenge. The whole, like, you've not given yourself over to like even understand whether you can be empathetic in this situation, hear another person's point of view, and understand how you would action accordingly. You've just gone, no, I don't like it, don't like the story, I'm out. And I'm like, no, it's not bad storytelling. It's you have failed. And I think in this film, it is challenging you on like, where are your empathies? There's a reason why it only gives you so much backstory for one character, and then or one victim, and then so much backstory for another one. It's asking you like, where are you agreeing with John Doe, and where are you disagreeing? Where are you agreeing with Mills or Somerset or Tracy even, and where are you not? Like, where are your morals? What is important to you as a person? And I think, like, interesting, because we've disagreed, we've had different interpretations of different moments because we have our own experiences that make our own morals and our own points of view individualistic. So we've gone into this film, which is 30 years later, with different points of opinion, and that is a really fun, good piece of art where we have conflicting, interesting, and valid points of view.
Did anyone else hear the mic drop?
Yeah. Boo, 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 boo. So, Vincent, I am going to bring us to a close, just because as I was talking, like, am I going to make this a 2-part episode? I don't even know. I'll see how long it is once I start editing it. But Vincent, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast episode of Se7en. I've so thoroughly enjoyed just going so deep into this film. Like we're just saying, it's so rich.
Mm-hmm.
But we are here to judge film and TV and wider media on how well they represent fat and larger bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So, out of a potential 5 Vincents, what would you score Se7en for fat representation?
I would probably have to score it a 0. Its fat representation is pretty bad.
Yes.
As a movie overall, I would give it 5 stars.
Literally.
But if we're using me as a way of assessing positive fat body representation, it doesn't do that at all. So no, it presents the fat body as grotesque and something to be dismissed and mocked. So yeah, it gets a 0 in that regard.
Yeah. I completely echo your opinion. It is a 0 Hannah's from me. It's a 5-star film. I will implore anyone to watch it anytime. But yeah, from a fat representation point of view solely, it really does miss the mark, unfortunately. But what I would say, and what I have said with quite a lot of the older films we do here, is not that it excuses it in any way, it's just an explanation, but body representation wasn't at the forefront of people's minds in the 90s, you know? This is quite a new thing, you know. Only in the past maybe decade have we been talking more about body positivity, body influence, body representation, as well as other obviously marginalized representations as well. So in 95, I can imagine it wasn't at the forefront of the casting director or David Fincher or anyone's mind that we should be more graceful with other body types than just your slender leading man of Brad Pitt's standard. And I do think it's very interesting that Brad Pitt is the one, or Mills is the one, who continuously is the one deriding other body types. Again, it's just like part of his personality at this point. So it's a 0 Hannah's, it's a 0 Vincent's. It is what it is, but it's still a 5-star film.
But it's a great movie. We both really like it, and everyone should see it.
Everyone.
Well, I say everyone. If you're squeamish, maybe not.
You know, it's interesting because as we were talking and you know, you were really getting me into this idea of like doing like a Fincher marathon, and I've got friends that we do like film nights with, and they're not the most I don't know thriller horror-y people, but I'm thinking they could get through Se7en. I think they could. So
you could really test them in terms of the abuse to the body type things and take them through, give them Se7en, Fight Club, and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Or if you want something a bit, easier, you can do a triple bill of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, The Social Network, and Mank.
They're like my 3 worst Finchers.
The Social Network is one of the best films of the 21st century. How dare you?
I am such a minority on that front. I really don't get it. I just think it's fine. I'm not saying it's the worst type of thing I've ever seen, but it just didn't appeal to me. I also have a visceral hatred of Justin Timberlake, so that doesn't help.
Well, it wouldn't, no.
It doesn't help at all. Anyway, right. Vincent, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Please, can you let the lovely listeners know where they can find more of your work?
Certainly. Well, you can find my sins, I mean my work, on the interwebs. You can find me at Dr. Gaine. That's DRGAINE. That is my handle on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. From Twitter, I post links to my various reviews on sites like The Geek Show and The Critical Movie Critics and Bloody Good Screen. You can also find me on the monthly podcast Invasion of the Poddy People, where myself and my fellow hosts Russell and James talk about genre film every month. We do recommendations, including we did in a most recent episode, I recommended a podcast called Fats on Film and got you a couple of new subscribers. You're welcome.
Oh my gosh. Oh, thank you so much, Vincent. I had no idea I've been recommended in that way. Thank you. Oh, that makes me so happy.
So you can find that podcast, Invasion of the Poddy People, on the feed from the Not Just for Kids movie club.
Yes.
And if you visit my blog, Vincent's Views, I have links there to my various podcast appearances in such places as Not Just for Kids, Civico, The Road to Avatar, Would You Die, and Drunken Horror podcast.
Oh, amazing. Well, I will have all the links to your socials below in the show notes so people can quickly access what they need to do. And people, the lovely listeners, can find the podcast at Fats on Film on Twitter and Instagram, and myself at Queen Bee Says on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Thank you so much for listening, and stay fat.